Chapter 15. The Perception of Time. In the next 2 chapters one shall deal with what is sometimes called internal perception, or the perception of time, and of events as occupying a date therein, especially when the date is a past one. In which case the perception in question goes by the name of memory. To remember a thing as past, it is necessary that the notion of past should be one of our ideas. We shall see in the chapter on memory that many things come to be thought by us as past, not because of any intrinsic quality of their own, but rather because they are associated with other things which for us signify pastness. But how do these things get their pastness? What is the original of our experience of pastness, from whence we get the meaning of the term? It is this question which the reader is invited to consider in the present chapter. We shall see that we have a constant feeling sui generis of pastness, to which every one of our experiences in turn falls a prey. To think a thing as past is to think it amongst the objects or in the direction of the objects which at the present moment appear affected by this quality. This is the original of our notion of pastime, upon which memory and history build their systems. And in this chapter we shall consider this immediate sense of time alone. If the constitution of consciousness were that of a string of bead-like sensations and images, all separate, we never could have any knowledge except that of the present instant. The moment each of our sensations ceased it would be gone forever. And we should be as if we had never been. We should be wholly, page 606, incapable of acquiring experience. Even if our ideas were associated in trains, but only as they are in imagination, we should still be without the capacity of acquiring knowledge. One idea, upon this supposition, would follow another. But that would be all. Each of our successive states of consciousness, the moment it ceased, would be gone forever. Each of those momentary states would be our whole being. 505. We might, nevertheless, under these circumstances, act in a rational way, provided the mechanism which produced our trains of images produced them in a rational order. We should make appropriate speeches, though unaware of any word except the one just on our lips. We should decide upon the right policy without ever a glimpse of the total grounds of our choice. Our consciousness would be like a glowworm spark, illuminating the point it immediately covered, but leaving all beyond in total darkness. Whether a very highly developed practical life be possible under such conditions as these is more than doubtful. It is, however, conceivable. I make the fanciful hypothesis merely to set off our real nature by the contrast. Our feelings are not thus contracted, and our consciousness never shrinks to the dimensions of a glowworm spark. The knowledge of some other part of the stream, past or future, near or remote, is always mixed in with our knowledge of the present thing. A simple sensation, as we shall hereafter see, is an abstraction, and all our concrete states of mind are representations of objects with some amount of complexity. Part of the complexity is the echo of the objects just past, and, in a less degree, perhaps, the foretaste of those just to arrive. Objects fade out of consciousness slowly. If the present thought is of A, B, C, D, E, F, G, the next one will be of B, C, D, E, F, G, H, and the one after that of C, D, E, F, G, H, I, the lingerings of the past dropping successively away, and the incomings of the future making up the loss. These lingerings of old objects, these incomings of new, are the germs of memory in expectation, the retrospective and the prospective sense of time. They give that continuity to, page 607, consciousness without which it could not be called a stream. 506. Page 608, the sensible present has duration. Let anyone try, I will not say to arrest, but to notice or attend to, the present moment of time. One of the most baffling experiences occurs. Where is it, this present? It has melted in our grasp, fled ere we could touch it, gone in the instant of becoming. As a poet, quoted by Mr. Hodgson, says, Le moment où je parle est déjà loin de moi. And it is only as entering into the living and moving organization of a much wider tract of time that the strict present is apprehended at all. It is, in fact, an altogether ideal abstraction, not only never realized in sense, but probably never even conceived of by those unaccustomed to philosophic meditation. Reflection leads us to the conclusion, p. 609, that it must exist, but that it does exist can never be a fact of our immediate experience. The only fact of our immediate experience is what Mr. E. R. Clay has well called the specious present. His words deserve to be quoted in full. Frowny face 507. The relation of experience to time has not been profoundly studied. Its objects are given as being of the present, but the part of time referred to by the datum is a very different thing from the conterminous of the past and future which philosophy denotes by the name present. The present to which the datum refers is really a part of the past, a recent past delusively given as being a time that intervenes between the past and the future. Let it be named the specious present, and let the past, that is given as being the past, be known as the obvious past. All the notes of a bar of a song seem to the listener to be contained in the present. All the changes of place of a meteor seem to the beholder to be contained in the present. At the instant of the termination of such series, no part of the time measured by them seems to be a past. Time, then, considered relatively to human apprehension, consists of four parts, viz., the obvious past, the specious present, the real present, and the future. Omitting the specious present, it consists of three nonentities: the past, which does not exist, the future, which does not exist, and their conterminous, the present. The faculty from which it proceeds lies to us in the fiction of the specious present. In short, the practically cognized present is no knife edge, but a saddleback, with a certain breadth of its own on which we sit perched, and from which we look in two directions into time. The unit of composition of our perception of time is a duration, with a bow and a stern, as it were, a rearward and a forward-looking end. 508, it is only, p. 610, as parts of this duration block that the relation of succession of one end to the other is perceived. We do not first feel one end and then feel the other after it, and from the perception of the succession infer an interval of time between, but we seem to feel the interval of time as a whole, with its two ends embedded in it. The experience is from the outset a synthetic datum, not a simple one, and to sensible perception its elements are inseparable, although attention looking back may easily decompose the experience, and distinguish its beginning from its end. When we come to study the perception of space, we shall find it quite analogous to time in this regard. Date in time corresponds to position in space. And although we now mentally construct large spaces by mentally imagining remoter and remoter positions, just as we now construct great durations by mentally prolonging a series of successive dates, yet the original experience of both space and time is always of something already given as a unit, inside of which attention afterward discriminates parts in relation to each other. Without the parts already given as in a time and in a space, subsequent discrimination of them could hardly do more than perceive them as different from each other. It would have no motive for calling the difference temporal order in this instance and spatial position in that. And just as in certain experiences we may be conscious of an extensive space full of objects, without locating each of them distinctly therein, so, when many impressions follow an excessively rapid succession in time, although we may be distinctly aware that they occupy some duration, and are not simultaneous, we may be quite at a loss to tell which comes first and which last. Or we may even invert their real order in our judgment. In complicated reaction time experiments, where signals and motions, and clicks of the apparatus come in exceedingly rapid order, one is at first much perplexed in deciding what the order is. Yet of the fact of its occupancy of time we are never in doubt. Page 611, Accuracy of our estimate of short durations. We must now proceed to an account of the facts of time perception in detail as preliminary to our speculative conclusion. Many of the facts are matters of patient experimentation, others of common experience. First of all, we note a marked difference between the elementary sensations of duration and those of space. The former have a much narrower range. The time sense may be called a myopic organ, in comparison with the eye, for example. The eye sees rods, acres, even miles, at a single glance, and these totals it can afterward subdivide into an almost infinite number of distinctly identified parts. The units of duration, on the other hand, which the time sense is able to take in at a single stroke, are groups of a few seconds, and within these units very few subdivisions, perhaps 40 at most, as we shall presently see, can be clearly discerned. The durations we have practically most to deal with, minutes, hours, and days, have to be symbolically conceived, and constructed by mental addition, after the fashion of those extents of hundreds of miles and upward, which in the field of space are beyond the range of most men's practical interests altogether. To realize a quarter of a mile we need only look out of the window and feel its length by an act which, though it may in part result from organized associations, yet seems immediately performed. To realize an hour, we must count now. 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 Indefinitely. Each now is the feeling of a separate bit of time, and the exact sum of the bits never makes a very clear impression on our mind. How many bits can we clearly apprehend at once? Very few if they are long bits, more if they are extremely short, most if they come to us in compound groups, each including smaller bits of its own. Hearing is the sense by which the subdivision of durations is most sharply made. Almost all the experimental work on the time sense has been done by means of strokes of sound. How long a series of sounds, then, can we group in the mind so as not to confound it with a longer or a shorter series? p. 612, our spontaneous tendency is to break up any monotonously given series of sounds into some sort of a rhythm. We involuntarily accentuate every second, or third, or fourth beat, or we break the series in still more intricate ways. Whenever we thus grasp the impressions in rhythmic form, we can identify a longer string of them without confusion. Each variety of verse, for example, has its law. And the recurrent stresses and sinkings make us feel with peculiar readiness the lack of a syllable or the presence of one too much. Divers verses may again be bound together in the form of a stanza, and we may then say of another stanza, its second verse differs by so much from that of the first stanza. When but for the felt stanza form the two differing verses would have come to us too separately to be compared at all. But these superposed systems of rhythm soon reach their limit. In music, as Wundt, 509, says, while the measure may easily contain 12 changes of intensity of sound, as in December 8th time, the rhythmical group may embrace 6 measures, and the period consist of 4, exceptionally of 5. 8. Groups. Wundt and his pupil Dietz have both tried to determine experimentally the maximal extent of our immediate distinct consciousness for successive impressions. Wundt found, 510, that 12 impressions could be distinguished clearly as a united cluster, provided they were caught in a certain rhythm by the mind, and succeeded each other at intervals not smaller than 0.3 and not larger than 0.5 of a second. This makes the total time distinctly apprehended to be equal to from 3.6 to 6 seconds. Dietz, 511, gives larger figures. The most favorable intervals for clearly catching the strokes were when they came at from 0.3 second to 0.18 second apart. 40 strokes might then be remembered as a whole, and identified without error when repeated, provided the mind grasped them in 5 subgroups of 8, or in 8 subgroups of 5 strokes each. When no grouping of the strokes beyond making couples of p. 613, them by the attention was allowed, and practically it was found impossible not to group them in at least this simplest of all ways. 16 was the largest number that could be clearly apprehended as a whole, 512, this would make 40 times 0. 3 second, or 12 seconds, to be the maximum filled duration of which we can be both distinctly and immediately aware. The maximum unfilled, or vacant duration, seems to lie within the same objective range. Estel and Menner, also working in Wundt's laboratory, found it to vary from 5 or 6 to 12 seconds, and perhaps more. The differences seem due to practice rather than to idiosyncrasy. 513. These figures may be roughly taken to stand for the most important part of what, with Mr. Clay, we called, a few pages back, the specious present. The specious present has, in addition, a vaguely vanishing backward and forward fringe. But its nucleus is probably the dozen seconds or less that have just elapsed. If these are the maximum, what, then, is the minimum amount of duration which we can distinctly feel? The smallest figure experimentally ascertained was by Exner, who distinctly heard the doubleness of 2 successive clicks of a Savart's wheel, and of 2 successive snaps, p. 614, of an electric spark, when their interval was made as small as about 1/500 of a second, 514. With the eye, perception is less delicate. 2 sparks, made to fall beside each other in rapid succession on the center of the retina, ceased to be recognized as successive by Exner when their interval fell below 0.044 inch. 515. Where, as here, the succeeding impressions are only 2 in number, we can easiest perceive the interval between them. President Hall, who experimented with a modified Savart's wheel, which gave clicks in varying number and at varying intervals, says Frownyface 516. In order that their discontinuity may be clearly perceived, 4 or even 3 clicks or beats must be farther apart than 2 need to be. When 2 are easily distinguished, 3 or 4 separated by the same interval are often confidently pronounced to be 2 or 3 respectively. It would be well if observations were so directed as to ascertain, at least up to 10 or 20, the increase, of interval, required by each additional click in a series for the sense of discontinuity to remain constant throughout. 517. p. 615, where the first impression falls on one sense, and the second on another, the perception of the intervening time tends to be less certain and delicate, and it makes a difference which impression comes first. Thus, Exner found, 518, the smallest perceptible interval to be, in seconds. From sight to touch, 0.071. From touch to sight, 0.053. From sight to hearing, 0.16. From hearing to sight, 0.06. From one ear to another, 0.064. To be conscious of a time interval at all is one thing, to tell whether it be shorter or longer than another interval is a different thing. A number of experimental data are on hand which give us a measure of the delicacy of this latter perception. The problem is that of the smallest difference between 2 times which we can perceive. The difference is at its minimum when the times themselves are very short. Exner, 519, reacting as rapidly as possible with his foot, upon a signal seen by the eye, spark, noted all the reactions which seemed to him either slow or fast in the making. He thought thus that deviations of about 1/100 of a second either way from the average were, page 616, correctly noticed by him at the time. The average was here 0.1840 inch. Hall and Jastrow listened to the intervals between the clicks of their apparatus. Between 2 such equal intervals of 4.27 inch each, a middle interval was included, which might be made either shorter or longer than the extremes. After the series had been heard 2 or even 3 times, no impression of the relative length of the middle interval would often exist. And only after hearing the 4th and last, repetition of the series, would the judgment incline to the plus or minus side. Inserting the variable between 2 invariable and like intervals greatly facilitated judgment, which between 2 unlike terms is far less accurate. 520. 3 observers in these experiments made no error when the middle interval varied 1/60th from the extremes. When it varied 1/120, errors occurred, but were few. This would make the minimum absolute difference perceived as large as 0.355. This minimum absolute difference, of course, increases as the times compared grow long. Attempts have been made to ascertain what ratio it bears to the times themselves. According to Fechner's psychophysic law, it ought always to bear the same ratio. Various observers, however, have found this not to be the case. 521, on the contrary. Very interesting oscillations in the accuracy of judgment and in the direction of the error, oscillations dependent upon the absolute amount of the times compared, have been noticed by all who have experimented with the question. Of these a brief account may be given. In the first place, in every list of intervals experimented with there will be found what Weyrord calls an indifference point. That is to say, an interval which we judge with maximum accuracy, a time which we tend to estimate as neither longer or shorter than it really is, and away from which, page 617, in both directions, errors increase their size. 522, this time varies from one observer to another, but its average is remarkably constant, as the following table shows. 523. The times, noted by the ear, and the average indifference points, given in seconds, were 4. Wundt, 524. 0.72. Collard, 525. 0. 75. Estel, probably. 0.75. Menner. 0.71. Stevens, 526. 0.71. Mach, 527. 0.35. Bucola, about, 528. 0.40. The odd thing about these figures is the recurrence they show in so many men of about 3/4 of a second, page 618, as the interval of time most easy to catch and reproduce. Odder still, both Estel and Menner found that multiples of this time were more accurately reproduced than the time intervals of intermediary length. Winkworth found 529, and Glass found a certain periodicity, with the constant increment of 1.25 seconds. In his observations, there would seem thus to exist something like a periodic or rhythmic sharpening of our time sense, of which the period differs somewhat from one observer to the next. Our sense of time, like other senses, seems subject to the law of contrast. It appeared pretty plainly in Estel's observations that an interval sounded shorter if a long one had immediately preceded it, and longer when the opposite was the case. Like other senses, too, our sense of time is sharpened by practice. Menner ascribes almost all the discrepancies between other observers and himself to this cause alone. 530. Tracks of time filled, with clicks of sound, seem longer than vacant ones of the same duration, when the latter does not exceed a second or two. 531. This, which reminds one of what happens with spaces seen by the eye, becomes reversed when longer times are taken. It is, perhaps, in accordance with this law that a loud sound, limiting a short interval of time, makes it appear longer, a slight sound shorter. In comparing intervals marked out by sounds, we must take care to keep the sounds uniform. 532. There is a certain emotional feeling accompanying the intervals of time, as is well known in music. The sense of haste goes with one measure of rapidity, that of delay with another, and these two feelings harmonize with different mental moods. Weyerwood listened to series of strokes performed by a metronome at rates varying from 40 to 200 page 619, minute, and found that they very naturally fell into 7 categories, from very slow to very fast. 533, each category of feeling included the intervals following each other within a certain range of speed, and no others. This is a qualitative, not a quantitative judgment, an aesthetic judgment, in fact. The middle category, of speed that was neutral, or, as he calls it, adequate, contained intervals that were grouped about 0.62 second, and Weyerwood says that this made what one might almost call an agreeable time. 534. The feeling of time and accent in music, of rhythm, is quite independent of that of melody. Tunes with marked rhythm can be readily recognized when simply drummed on the table with the fingertips. We have no sense for empty time. Although subdividing the time by beats of sensation aids our accurate knowledge of the amount of it that elapses, such subdivision does not seem at the first glance essential to our perception of its flow. Let one sit with closed eyes and, abstracting entirely from the outer world, attend exclusively to the passage of time, like one who wakes, as the poet says, to hear time flowing in the middle of the night, and all things moving to a day of doom. There seems under such circumstances as these no variety in the material content of our thought, and what we notice appears, if anything, to be the pure series of durations budding, as it were, and growing beneath our indrawn gaze. Is this really so or not? The question is important, for, if the experience be what it roughly seems, we have a sort of special sense for pure time, a sense to which empty duration is an adequate stimulus. While if it be an illusion, it must be that our perception of time's flight, in the experiences quoted, is due to the filling of the time, and to our memory of a content which it had a moment previous, and which we feel to agree or disagree with its content now. It takes but a small exertion of introspection to show, page 620, that the latter alternative is the true one, and that we can no more intuit a duration than we can intuit an extension, devoid of all sensible content. Just as with closed eyes we perceive a dark visual field in which a curdling play of obscurest luminosity is always going on, so, be we never so abstracted from distinct outward impressions, we are always inwardly immersed in what Wundt has somewhere called the twilight of our general consciousness. Our heartbeats, our breathing, the pulses of our attention, fragments of words or sentences that pass through our imagination, are what people this dim habitat. Now, all these processes are rhythmical, and are apprehended by us, as they occur, in their totality, the breathing and pulses of attention, as coherent successions, each with its rise and fall. The heart beats similarly, only relatively far more brief, the words not separately, but in connected groups. In short, empty our minds as we may, some form of changing process remains for us to feel, and cannot be expelled. And along with the sense of the process and its rhythm goes the sense of the length of time it lasts. Awareness of change is thus the condition on which our perception of time's flow depends. But there exists no reason to suppose that empty time's own changes are sufficient for the awareness of change to be aroused. The change must be of some concrete sort, an outward or inward sensible series, or a process of attention or volition. 535. Page 621, and here again we have an analogy with space. The earliest form of distinct space perception is undoubtedly that of a movement over some one of our sensitive surfaces, and this movement is originally given as a simple whole of feeling, and is only decomposed into its elements, successive positions successively occupied by the moving body, when our education in discrimination is much advanced. Page 622, but a movement is a change, a process, so we see that in the time world and the space world alike the first known things are not elements, but combinations, not separate units, but wholes already formed. The condition of being of the wholes may be the elements, but the condition of our knowing the elements is our having already felt the wholes as wholes. In the experience of watching empty time flow, empty, to be taken hereafter in the relative sense just set forth, we tell it off in pulses. We say, now. Now. Now, or we count, more. More. More, as we feel it bud. This composition out of units of duration is called the law of time's discrete flow. The discreteness is, however, merely due to the fact that our successive acts of recognition or apperception of what it is are discrete. The sensation is as continuous as any sensation can be. All continuous sensations are named in beats. We notice that a certain finite more of them is passing or already passed. To adopt Hodgson's image, the sensation is the measuring tape, the perception the dividing engine which stamps its length. As we listen to a steady sound, we take it in discrete pulses of recognition, calling it successively, the same. The same. The same. The case stands no otherwise with time. After a small number of beats our impression of the amount we have told off becomes quite vague. Our only way of knowing it accurately is by counting, or noticing the clock, or through some other symbolic conception. 536, when the times exceed hours or days, the conception is absolutely symbolic. We think of the amount we mean either solely as a name, or by running over a few salient dates therein, with no pretense of imagining the full durations that lie between them. No one has anything like a perception of the greater length of the time between now and the 1st century than of that between now and the 10th. To an historian, p. 623, it is true, the longer interval will suggest a host of additional dates and events, and so appear a more multitudinous thing. And for the same reason most people will think they directly perceive the length of the past fortnight to exceed that of the past week. But there is properly no comparative time intuition in these cases at all. It is but dates and events, representing time, their abundance symbolizing its length. I am sure that this is so, even where the times compared are no more than an hour or so in length. It is the same with spaces of many miles, which we always compare with each other by the numbers which measure them, 537. Page 624, from this we pass naturally to speak of certain familiar variations in our estimation of lengths of time. In general, a time filled with varied and interesting experiences seems short in passing, but long as we look back. On the other hand, a tract of time empty of experiences seems long in passing, but in retrospect short. A week of travel and sightseeing may subtend an angle more like 3 weeks in the memory, and a month of sickness hardly yields more memories than a day. The length in retrospect depends obviously on the multitudinousness of the memories which the time affords. Many objects, events, changes, many subdivisions, immediately widen the view as we look back. Emptiness, monotony, familiarity, make it shrivel up. In Vaughan Holtei's Vagabonds, one Anton is described as revisiting his native village. 7 years, he exclaims, 7 years since I ran away. More like 70 it seems, so much has happened. I cannot think of it all without becoming dizzy, at any rate not now. And yet again, when I look at the village, at the church tower, it seems as if I could hardly have been 7 days away. Prof. Lazarus, 538, from whom I borrow this quotation, thus explains both of these contrasted illusions by our principle of the awakened memories being multitudinous or few. The circle of experiences, widely extended, rich in variety, which he had in view on the day of his leaving the village rises now in his mind as its image lies before him. And with it, in rapid succession and violent motion, not in chronologic order, or from chronologic motives, but suggesting each other by all sorts of connections, arise massive images of all his rich vagabondage and roving life. They roll and wave confusedly together, first perhaps one from the first year, then from the 6th, soon from the 2nd, again from the 5th, the page 625, first, etc. Until it seems as if 70 years must have been there, and he reels with the fullness of his vision. Then the inner eye turns away from all this past. The outer one turns to the village, especially to the church tower. The sight of it calls back the old sight of it, so that the consciousness is filled with that alone, or almost alone. The one vision compares itself with the other, and looks so near, so unchanged, that it seems as if only a week of time could have come between. The same space of time seems shorter as we grow older, that is, the days, the months, and the years do so, whether the hours do so is doubtful, and the minutes and seconds to all appearance remain about the same. Whoever counts many lustra in his memory need only question himself to find that the last of these, the past 5 years, have sped much more quickly than the preceding periods of equal amount. Let any one remember his last 8 or 10 school years, it is the space of a century. Compare with them the last 8 or 10 years of life, it is the space of an hour. So writes Prof. Paul Janet, 539, and gives a solution which can hardly be said to diminish the mystery. There is a law, he says, by which the apparent length of an interval at a given epoch of a man's life is proportional to the total length of the life itself. A child of 10 feels a year as 1/10 of his whole life, a man of 50 as 1/50, the whole life meanwhile apparently preserving a constant length. This formula roughly expresses the phenomena, it is true, but cannot possibly be an elementary psychic law. And it is certain that, in great part at least, the foreshortening of the years as we grow older is due to the monotony of memory's content, and the consequent simplification of the backward-glancing view. In youth we may have an absolutely new experience, subjective or objective, every hour of the day. Apprehension is vivid, retentiveness strong, and our recollections of that time, like those of a time spent in rapid and interesting travel, are of something intricate, multitudinous, and long drawn out. But as each passing year converts some of this experience into automatic routine which we hardly note at all, the days and the weeks smooth themselves out in recollection to contentless units, and the years grow hollow and collapse. p. 626, so much for the apparent shortening of tracks of time in retrospect. They shorten in passing whenever we are so fully occupied with their content as not to note the actual time itself. A day full of excitement, with no pause, is said to pass ere we know it. On the contrary, a day full of waiting, of unsatisfied desire for change, will seem a small eternity. Tedium, ennui, languile, boredom, are words for which, probably, every language known to man has its equivalent. It comes about whenever, from the relative emptiness of content of a tract of time, we grow attentive to the passage of the time itself. Expecting, and being ready for, a new impression to succeed. When it fails to come, we get an empty time instead of it, and such experiences, ceaselessly renewed, make us most formidably aware of the extent of the mere time itself. 540. Close your eyes and simply wait to hear somebody tell you that a minute has elapsed. The full length of your leisure with it seems incredible. You engulf yourself into its bowels as into those of that interminable first week of an ocean voyage, and find yourself wondering that history can have overcome many such periods in its course. All because you attend so closely to the mere feeling of the time per se, and because your attention to that is susceptible of such fine-grained successive subdivision. The odiousness of the whole experience comes from its insipidity. For stimulation is the indispensable requisite for pleasure in an experience, and the feeling of bare time is the least stimulating experience we can have. 541. The sensation of tedium is a protest, says Volkmann, against the entire present. p. 627. Exactly parallel variations occur in our consciousness of space. A road we walk back over, hoping to find at each step an object we have dropped, seems to us longer than when we walked over it the other way. A space we measure by pacing appears longer than one we traverse with no thought of its length. And in general an amount of space attended to in itself leaves with us more impression of spaciousness than one of which we only note the content. 542. I do not say that everything in these fluctuations of estimate can be accounted for by the time's content being crowded and interesting, or simple and tame. Both in the shortening of time by old age and in its lengthening by ennui some deeper cause may be at work. This cause can only be ascertained, if it exist, by finding out why we perceive time at all. To this inquiry let us, though without much hope, proceed. The feeling of past time is a present feeling. If asked why we perceive the light of the sun, or the sound of an explosion, we reply, because certain outer forces, ether waves or air waves, smite upon the brain, awakening therein changes, to which the conscious perceptions, light and sound, respond. But we hasten to add that neither light nor sound copy or mirror the ether or air waves, they represent them only symbolically. The only case, says Helmholtz, in which such copying occurs, and in which, p. 628. Our perceptions can truly correspond with outer reality, is that of the time succession of phenomena. Simultaneity, succession, and the regular return of simultaneity or succession, can obtain as well in sensations as in outer events. Events, like our perceptions of them, take place in time, so that the time relations of the latter can furnish a true copy of those of the former. The sensation of the thunder follows the sensation of the lightning just as the sonorous convulsing of the air by the electric discharge reaches the observer's place later than that of the luminiferous ether. 543. One experiences an almost instinctive impulse, in pursuing such reflections as these, to follow them to a sort of crude speculative conclusion, and to think that he has at last got the mystery of cognition where, to use a vulgar phrase, the wool is short. What more natural, we say, than that the sequences and durations of things should become known? The succession of the outer forces stamps itself as a like succession upon the brain. The brain's successive changes are copied exactly by correspondingly successive pulses of the mental stream. The mental stream, feeling itself, must feel the time relations of its own states. But as these are copies of the outward time relations, so must it know them too. That is to say, these latter time relations arouse their own cognition. Or, in other words, the mere existence of time in those changes out of the mind which affect the mind is a sufficient cause why time is perceived by the mind. This philosophy is unfortunately too crude. Even though we were to conceive the outer successions as forces stamping their image on the brain, and the brain successions as forces stamping their image on the mind, 544, still, between the mind's own changes being successive, and knowing their own succession, lies as broad a chasm as between the object and subject of any case of cognition in the world. A succession of feelings, in and of itself, is not a feeling of succession. And since, to our successive feelings, a feeling of their own succession is added, that must be treated as an p. 629, additional fact requiring its own special elucidation, which this talk about outer time relations stamping copies of themselves within, leaves all untouched. I have shown, at the outset of the article, that what is past, to be known as past, must be known with what is present, and during the present spot of time. As the clear understanding of this point has some importance, let me, at the risk of repetition, recur to it again. Volkmann has expressed the matter admirably, as follows. One might be tempted to answer the question of the origin of the time idea by simply pointing to the train of ideas, whose various members, starting from the first, successively attain to full clearness. But against this it must be objected that the successive ideas are not yet the idea of succession, because succession in thought is not the thought of succession. If idea A follows idea B, consciousness simply exchanges one for another. That becomes after A is for our consciousness a non-existent fact, for this after is given neither in B nor in A, and no third idea has been supposed. The thinking of the sequence of B upon A is another kind of thinking from that which brought forth A and then brought forth B, and this first kind of thinking is absent so long as merely the thinking of A and the thinking of B are there. In short, when we look at the matter sharply, we come to this antithesis, that if A and B are to be represented as occurring in succession they must be simultaneously represented. If we are to think of them as one after the other, we must think them both at once. 545. If we represent the actual time stream of our thinking by an horizontal line, the thought of the stream or of any segment of its length, past, present, or to come, might be figured in a perpendicular raised upon the horizontal at a certain point. The length of this perpendicular stands for a certain object or content, which in this case is the time thought of, and all of which is thought of together at the actual moment of the stream upon which the perpendicular is raised. Mr. James Ward puts the matter very well in his masterly article, Psychology, in the 9th edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, page 64. He says, "We may, if we represent succession as a line, represent simultaneity as a second line at right angles to the first, empty time or time length without time breadth, we may say, is a mere abstraction. Now, it is with the former line that we have to do in treating of time, p. 630, as it is, and with the latter in treating of our intuition of time, where, just as in a perspective representation of distance, we are confined to lines in a plane at right angles to the actual line of depth. In a succession of events, say of sense impressions, A, B, C, D, E. The presence of B means the absence of A and C, but the presentation of this succession involves the simultaneous presence in some mode or other of two or more of the presentations A, B, C, D. In reality, past, present, and future are differences in time, but in presentation all that corresponds to these differences is in consciousness simultaneously. There is thus a sort of perspective projection of past objects upon present consciousness, similar to that of wide landscapes upon a camera screen. And since we saw a while ago that our maximum distinct intuition of duration hardly covers more than a dozen seconds, while our maximum vague intuition is probably not more than that of a minute or so, we must suppose that this amount of duration is pictured fairly steadily in each passing instant of consciousness by virtue of some fairly constant feature in the brain process to which the consciousness is tied. This feature of the brain process, whatever it be, must be the cause of our perceiving the fact of time at all, 546, the duration thus steadily perceived is hardly more than the specious present, as it was called a few pages back. Its content is in a constant flux, events dawning into its forward end as fast as they fade out of its rearward one, and each of them changing its time coefficient from not yet, or not quite yet, to just gone, or gone, as it passes by. Meanwhile, the specious present, the intuited duration, stands permanent, like the rainbow on the waterfall, with its own quality unchanged by the events that stream through it. Each of these, as it slips out, retains the power of being reproduced. And when reproduced, is reproduced with the duration and neighbors which it originally had. Please observe, however, that the reproduction of an event, after it has once completely dropped out of the rearward end of the specious present, is an entirely different psychic fact from its direct perception in the specious present as a thing immediately past. A creature might be entirely devoid of reproductive memory, and yet have the time sense, but the page 631 latter would be limited, in his case, to the few seconds immediately passing by. Time older than that he would never recall. I assume reproduction in the text, because I am speaking of human beings who notoriously possess it. Thus memory gets strewn with dated things, dated in the sense of being before or after each other. 547. The date of a thing is a mere relation of before or after the present thing or some past or future thing. Some things we date simply by mentally tossing them into the past or future direction. So in space we think of England as simply to the eastward, of Charleston as lying south. But, again, we may date an event exactly, by fitting it between two terms of a past or future series explicitly conceived, just as we may accurately think of England or Charleston being just so many miles away. 548. The things and events thus vaguely or exactly dated become thenceforward those signs and symbols of longer time spaces, of which we previously spoke. According as we think of a multitude of them, or of few, so we imagine the time they represent to be long or short. But the original paragon and prototype of all conceived times is the specious present, the short duration of which we are immediately and incessantly sensible. Page 632, to what cerebral process is the sense of time due? Now, to what element in the brain process may this sensibility be due? It cannot, as we have seen, be due to the mere duration itself of the process. It must be due to an element present at every moment of the process, and this element must bear the same inscrutable sort of relation to its correlative feeling which all other elements of neural activity bear to their psychic products. Be the latter what they may. Several suggestions have been made as to what the element is in the case of time. Treating of them in a note, 549, I will try to express briefly the only conclusion which, p. 633, seems to emerge from a study of them and of the facts, unripe though that conclusion be. Page 634, the phenomena of summation of stimuli in the nervous system prove that each stimulus leaves some latent activity, p. 635, behind it which only gradually passes away. See above, pages 82 to 85. Psychological proof of the same fact is afforded by those after-images, which we perceive when a sensorial stimulus is gone. We may read off peculiarities in an after-image, left by an object on the eye, which we failed to note in the original. We may hark back and take in the meaning of a sound several seconds after it has ceased. Delay for a minute, however, and the echo itself of the clock or the question is mute, present sensations have banished it beyond recall. With the feeling of the present thing there must at all times mingle the fading echo of all those other things which the previous few seconds have supplied. Or, to state it in neural terms, there is at every moment accumulation of brain processes overlapping each other, of which the fainter ones are the dying phases of processes which but shortly previous were active in a maximal degree. The amount of the overlapping determines the feeling of the duration occupied. What events shall appear to occupy the duration depends on just what processes the overlapping processes are. We know so little of the intimate nature of the brain's activity that even where a sensation monotonously endures, we cannot say that the earlier moments of it do, p. 636, not leave fading processes behind which coexist with those of the present moment. Duration and events together form our intuition of the specious present with its content. 550. Why such an intuition should result from such a combination of brain processes I do not pretend to say. All I aim at is to state the most elemental form of the psychophysical conjunction. I have assumed that the brain processes are sensational ones. Processes of active attention, see Mr. Ward's account in the long footnote, will leave similar fading brain processes behind. If the mental processes are conceptual, a complication is introduced of which I will in a moment speak. Meanwhile, still speaking of sensational processes, a remark of Wundt's will throw additional light on the account I give. As is known, Wundt and others have proved that every act of perception of a sensorial stimulus takes an appreciable time. When two different stimuli, e.g., a sight and a sound, are given at once or nearly at once, we have difficulty in attending to both, and may wrongly judge their interval, or even invert their order. Now, as the result of his experiments on such stimuli, Wundt lays down this law frowny face 551, that of the three possible determinations we may make of their order. Namely, simultaneity, continuous transition, and discontinuous transition. Only the first and last are realized, never the second. Invariably, when we fail to perceive the impressions as simultaneous, we notice a shorter or longer empty time between them, which seems to correspond to the sinking of one of the ideas and to the rise of the other. For our attention may share itself equally between the two impressions, which will then compose one total percept, and be simultaneously felt, or it may be so adapted to one event as to cause, p. 637, it to be perceived immediately, and then the second event can be perceived only after a certain time of latency, during which the attention reaches its effective maximum for it and diminishes for the first event. In this case the events are perceived as two, and in successive order, that is, as separated by a time interval in which attention is not sufficiently accommodated to either to bring a distinct perception about. While we are hurrying from one to the other, everything between them vanishes in the twilight of general consciousness. 552. One might call this the law of discontinuous succession in time, of percepts to which we cannot easily attend at once. Each percept then requires a separate brain process, and when one brain process is at its maximum, the other would appear perforce to be in either a waning or a waxing phase. If our theory of the time feeling be true, empty time must then subjectively appear to separate the two percepts, no matter how close together they may objectively be. For, according to that theory, the feeling of a time duration is the immediate effect of such an overlapping of brain page 638, cesses of different phase, wherever and from whatever cause it may occur. To pass, now, to conceptual processes, suppose I think of the creation, then of the Christian era, then of the Battle of Waterloo, all within a few seconds. These matters have their dates far outside the specious present. The processes by which I think them, however, all overlap. What events, then, does the specious present seem to contain? Simply my successive acts of thinking these long-past things, not the long-past things themselves. As the instantly present thought may be of a long-past thing, so the just-past thought may be of another long-past thing. When a long-past event is reproduced in memory and conceived with its date, the reproduction and conceiving traverse the specious present. The immediate content of the latter is thus all my direct experiences, whether subjective or objective. Some of these meanwhile may be representative of other experiences indefinitely remote. The number of these direct experiences which the specious present and immediately intuited past may embrace measures the extent of our primary, as Exner calls it, or, as Richer calls it, of our elementary memory. 553. The sensation resultant from the overlapping is that of the duration which the experiences seem to fill. As is the number of any larger set of events to that of these experiences, so we suppose is the length of that duration to this duration. But of the longer duration we have no direct realizing sense. The variations in our appreciation of the same amount of real time may possibly be explained by alterations in the rate of fading in the images, producing changes in the complication of superposed processes. to which changes changed states of consciousness may correspond. But however long we may conceive a space of time to be, the objective amount of it which is directly perceived at any one moment by us can never exceed the scope of our primary memory at the moment in question. 554. p. 639. We have every reason to think that creatures may possibly differ enormously in the amounts of duration which they intuitively feel, and in the fineness of the events that may fill it. Von Baer has indulged, 555, in some interesting computations of the effect of such differences in changing the aspect of nature. Suppose we were able, within the length of a second, to note 10,000 events distinctly, instead of barely 10, as now. If our life were then destined to hold the same number of impressions, it might be 1,000 times as short. We should live less than a month, and personally know nothing of the change of seasons. If born in winter, we should believe in summer as we now believe in the heats of the Carboniferous era. The motions of organic beings would be so slow to our senses as to be inferred, not seen. The sun would stand still in the sky, the moon be almost free from change, and so on. But now reverse the hypothesis and suppose a being to get only 1/1000th part of the sensations that we get in a given time, and consequently to live 1,000 times as long. Winters and summers will be to him like quarters of an hour. Mushrooms and the swifter growing plants will shoot into being so rapidly as to appear instantaneous creations, annual shrubs will rise and fall from the earth like restlessly boiling water springs. The motions of animals will be as invisible as are to us the movements of bullets and cannonballs, the sun will scour through the sky like a meteor, leaving a fiery trail behind him, etc. That such imaginary cases, barring the superhuman longevity, may be realized somewhere in the animal kingdom, it would be rash to deny. A gnat's wings, says Mr. Spencer, 556, make 10 or 15,000 strokes a second. Each stroke implies a separate nervous action. Each such nervous action or change in a nervous center is probably as appreciable by the gnat as is a quick movement of his arm by a man. And if this, or anything like this, is the fact, then the time occupied by a given external change, measured by many movements in the one case, must seem much longer than in the other case, when measured by one movement. In hashish intoxication there is a curious increase in the apparent time perspective. We utter a sentence, and ere, page 640, the end is reached the beginning seems already to date from indefinitely long ago. We enter a short street, and it is as if we should never get to the end of it. This alteration might conceivably result from an approach to the condition of von Baer's and Spencer's short-lived beings. If our discrimination of successions became finer-grained, so that we noted 10 stages in a process where previously we only noted one, and if at the same time the processes faded 10 times as fast as before, we might have a specious present of the same subjective length as now, giving us the same time feeling and containing as many distinguishable successive events. But out from the earlier end of it would have drooped 9/10 of the real events it now contains. They would have fallen into the general reservoir of merely dated memories, reproducible at will. The beginning of our sentences would have to be expressly recalled, each word would appear to pass through consciousness at 1/10 of its usual speed. The condition would, in short, be exactly analogous to the enlargement of space by a microscope. Fewer real things at once in the immediate field of view, but each of them taking up more than its normal room, and making the excluded one seem unnaturally far away. Under other conditions, processes seem to fade rapidly without the compensating increase in the subdivisibility of successions. Here the apparent length of the specious present contracts. Consciousness dwindles to a point, and loses all intuitive sense of the whence and whither of its path. Express acts of memory replace rapid bird's-eye views. In my own case, something like this occurs in extreme fatigue. Long illnesses produce it. Occasionally, it appears to accompany aphasia. 557, it would be vain to seek, page 641, to imagine the exact brain change in any of these cases. But we must admit the possibility that to some extent the variations of time estimate between youth and age, and excitement and ennui, are due to such causes, more immediate than to the one we assigned some time ago. But whether our feeling of the time which immediately passed, 558, events have filled be of something long or of something short, it is not what it is because those events are past, but because they have left behind them processes which are present. To those processes, however caused, the mind would still respond by feeling a specious present, with one part of it just vanishing or vanished into the past. As the Creator is supposed to have made Adam with a navel sign of a birth which never occurred, so he might instantaneously make a man with a brain in which were processes just like the fading ones of an ordinary brain. The first real stimulus after creation would set up a process additional to these. The processes would overlap. And the new created man would unquestionably have the feeling, at the very primal instant of his life, of having been in existence already some little space of time. p. 642, let me sum up, now, by saying that we are constantly conscious of a certain duration, the specious present varying in length from a few seconds to probably not more than a minute. And that this duration, with its content perceived as having one part earlier and the other part later, is the original intuition of time. Longer times are conceived by adding, shorter ones by dividing, portions of this vaguely bounded unit, and are habitually thought by us symbolically. Kant's notion of an intuition of objective time as an infinite necessary continuum has nothing to support it. The cause of the intuition which we really have cannot be the duration of our brain processes or our mental changes. That duration is rather the object of the intuition which, being realized at every moment of such duration, must be due to a permanently present cause. This cause, probably the simultaneous presence of brain processes of different phase fluctuates, and hence a certain range of variation in the amount of the intuition, and in its subdivisibility, accrues. Chapter 16. Memory. In the last chapter what concerned us was the direct intuition of time. We found it limited to intervals of considerably less than a minute. Beyond its borders extends the immense region of conceived time, past and future, into one direction or another of which we mentally project all the events which we think of as real, and form a systematic order of them by giving to each a date. The relation of conceived to intuited time is just like that of the fictitious space pictured on the flat back scene of a theater to the actual space of the stage. The objects painted on the latter, trees, columns, houses in a receding street, etc. Carry back the series of similar objects solidly placed upon the latter, and we think we see things in a continuous perspective, when we really see thus only a few of them and imagine that we see the rest. The chapter which lies before us deals with the way in which we paint the remote past, as it were, upon a canvas in our memory, and yet often imagine that we have direct vision of its depths. The stream of thought flows on. But most of its segments fall into the bottomless abyss of oblivion. Of some, no memory survives the instant of their passage. Of others, it is confined to a few moments, hours, or days. Others, again, leave vestiges which are indestructible, and by means of which they may be recalled as long as life endures. Can we explain these differences? Primary memory. The first point to be noticed is that for a state of mind to survive in memory it must have endured for a certain length of time. In other words, it must be what I call a substantive state. Prepositional and conjunctival states of mind are not remembered as independent facts. We cannot recall, page 644, just how we felt when we said, how, or notwithstanding. Our consciousness of these transitive states is shut up to their own moment, hence one difficulty in introspective psychologizing. Any state of mind which is shut up to its own moment and fails to become an object for succeeding states of mind, is as if it belonged to another stream of thought. Or rather, it belongs only physically, not intellectually, to its own stream, forming a bridge from one segment of it to another, but not being appropriated inwardly by later segments or appearing as part of the empirical self. In the manner explained in Chapter 10. All the intellectual value for us of a state of mind depends on our after-memory of it. Only then is it combined in a system and knowingly made to contribute to a result. Only then does it count for us. So that the effective consciousness we have of our states is the after-consciousness, and the more of this there is, the more influence does the original state have, and the more permanent a factor is it of our world. An indelibly imprinted pain may color a life, but, as Professor Richer says, to suffer for only 1/100th of a second is not to suffer at all. And for my part one would readily agree to undergo a pain, however acute and intense it might be, provided it should last only 1/100th of a second, and leave after it neither reverberation nor recall. 559. Not that a momentary state of consciousness need be practically resultless. Far from it, such a state, though absolutely unremembered, might at its own moment determine the transition of our thinking in a vital way, and decide our action irrevocably. 560, but the idea of it could not, p. 645, afterwards determine transition action. Its content could not be conceived as one of the mind's permanent meanings. That is all I mean by saying that its intellectual value lies in aftermemory. As a rule, sensations outlast for some little time the objective stimulus which occasioned them. This phenomenon is the ground of those after-images which are familiar in the physiology of the sense organs. If we open our eyes instantaneously upon a scene, and then shroud them in complete darkness, it will be as if we saw the scene in ghostly light throughout, the dark screen. We can read off details in it which were unnoticed whilst the eyes were open. 561. In every sphere of sense, an intermittent stimulus, often enough repeated, produces a continuous sensation. This is because the after-image of the impression just gone by blends with the new impression coming in. The effects of stimuli may thus be superposed upon each other many stages deep, the total result in consciousness being an increase in the feeling's intensity, and in all probability, as we saw in the last chapter, an elementary sense of the lapse of time. Cp. 635. Page 646, Exner writes. Impressions to which we are inattentive leave so brief an image in the memory that it is usually overlooked. When deeply absorbed, we do not hear the clock strike. But our attention may awake after the striking has ceased, and we may then count off the strokes. Such examples are often found in daily life. We can also prove the existence of this primary memory image, as it may be called, in another person, even when his attention is completely absorbed elsewhere. Ask someone, e.g., to count the lines of a printed page as fast as he can, and whilst this is going on walk a few steps about the room. Then, when the person has done counting, ask him where you stood. He will always reply quite definitely that you have walked. Analogous experiments may be done with vision. This primary memory image is, whether attention have been turned to the impression or not, an extremely lively one, but is subjectively quite distinct from every sort of after-image or hallucination. It vanishes, if not caught by attention, in the course of a few seconds. Even when the original impression is attended to, the liveliness of its image in memory fades fast. 562. The physical condition in the nerve tissue of this primary memory is called by Richer, elementary memory. 563. I much prefer to reserve the word memory for the conscious phenomenon. What happens in the nerve tissue is but an example of that plasticity or of semi-inertness, yielding to change, but not yielding instantly or wholly, and never quite recovering the original form, which, in Chapter 5, we saw to be the groundwork of habit. Elementary habit would be the better name for what Professor Richer means. Well, the first manifestation of elementary habit is the slow dying away of an impressed movement on the neural matter, and its first effect in consciousness is this so-called elementary memory. But what elementary memory makes us aware of is the just past. The objects we feel in this directly intuited past differ from properly recollected objects. An object which is recollected, in the proper sense of that term, is one which has been absent from consciousness altogether, and now revives anew. It is brought back, recalled, fished up, so to speak, from a reservoir in which, with countless other objects, it lay buried and lost from view. But an object of primary memory is not thus, page 647, brought back, it never was lost. Its date was never cut off in consciousness from that of the immediately present moment. In fact, it comes to us as belonging to the rearward portion of the present space of time, and not to the genuine past. In the last chapter we saw that the portion of time which we directly intuit has a breadth of several seconds, a rearward and a forward end, and may be called the specious present. All stimuli whose first nerve vibrations have not yet ceased seem to be conditions of our getting this feeling of the specious present. They give rise to objects which appear to the mind as events just past. 564. When we have been exposed to an unusual stimulus for many minutes or hours, a nervous process is set up which results in the haunting of consciousness by the impression for a long time afterwards. The tactile and muscular feelings of a day of skating or riding, after long disuse of the exercise, will come back to us all through the night. Images of the field of view of the microscope will annoy the observer for hours after an unusually long sitting at the instrument. A thread tied around the finger, an unusual constriction in the clothing, will feel as if still there, long after they have been removed. These revivals, called phenomena of Sinnesgedächtnis by the Germans, have something periodical in their nature. 565. They show that profound rearrangements and slow settlings into a new equilibrium are going on in the neural substance, and they form the transition to that more peculiar and proper phenomenon of memory, of which the rest of this chapter must treat. The p. 648, first condition which makes a thing susceptible of recall after it has been forgotten is that the original impression of it should have been prolonged enough to give rise to a recurrent image of it. As distinguished from one of those primary after-images which very fleeting impressions may leave behind, and which contain in themselves no guarantee that they will ever come back after having once faded away. 566. A certain length of stimulation seems demanded by the inertia of the nerve substance. Exposed to a shorter influence, its modification fails to set, and it retains no effective tendency to fall again into the same form of vibration at which the original feeling was due. This, as I said at the outset, may be the reason why only substantive and not transitive states of mind are as a rule recollected, at least as independent things. The transitive states pass by too quickly. Analysis of the phenomenon of memory. Memory proper, or secondary memory as it might be styled, is the knowledge of a former state of mind after it has already once dropped from consciousness. Or rather it is the knowledge of an event, or fact, of which meantime we have not been thinking, with the additional consciousness that we have thought or experienced it before. p. 649, the first element which such a knowledge involves would seem to be the revival in the mind of an image or copy of the original event. 567, and it is an assumption made by many writers, 568, that the revival of an image is all that is needed to constitute the memory of the original occurrence. But such a revival is obviously not a memory, whatever else it may be. It is simply a duplicate, a second event, having absolutely no connection with the first event except that it happens to resemble it. The clock strikes today, it struck yesterday, and may strike 1,000,000 times ere it wears out. The rain pours through the gutter this week, it did so last week, and will do so in soecula soecularum. But does the present clockstroke become aware of the past ones, or the present stream recollect the past stream, because they repeat and resemble them? Assuredly not. And let it not be said that this is because clockstrokes and gutters are physical and not psychical objects. For psychical objects, sensations for example, simply recurring in successive editions will remember each other on that account no more than clockstrokes do. No memory is involved in the mere fact of recurrence. The successive editions of a feeling are so many, page 650, independent events, each snug in its own skin. Yesterday's feeling is dead and buried, and the presence of today's is no reason why it should resuscitate. A farther condition is required before the present image can be held to stand for a past original. That condition is that the fact imaged be expressly referred to the past, thought as in the past. But how can we think a thing as in the past, except by thinking of the past together with the thing, and of the relation of the two? And how can we think of the past? In the chapter on time perception we have seen that our intuitive or immediate consciousness of pastness hardly carries us more than a few seconds backward of the present instant of time. Remoter dates are conceived, not perceived. Known symbolically by names, such as last week, 1850, or thought of by events which happened in them, as the year in which we attended such a school, or met with such a loss. So that, if we wish to think of a particular past epoch, we must think of a name or other symbol, or else of certain concrete events, associated therewithal. Both must be thought of, to think the past epoch adequately. And to refer any special fact to the past epoch is to think that fact with the names and events which characterize its date, to think it, in short, with a lot of contiguous associates. But even this would not be memory. Memory requires more than mere dating of a fact in the past. It must be dated in my past. In other words, I must think that I directly experienced its occurrence. It must have that warmth and intimacy, which were so often spoken of in the chapter on the self, as characterizing all experiences appropriated by the thinker as his own. A general feeling of the past direction in time, then, a particular date conceived as lying along that direction, and defined by its name or phenomenal contents, an event imagined as located therein, and owned as part of my experience. Such are the elements of every act of memory. It follows that what we began by calling the image, or copy, of the fact in the mind, is really not there at all in that simple shape, as a separate idea. Or at least, if it be there as a separate idea, no memory will go with it. What, p. 651, memory goes with is, on the contrary, a very complex representation, that of the fact to be recalled plus its associates, the whole forming one object, as explained on page 275, chapter 9. Known in one integral pulse of consciousness, as set forth on pp. 276 ff, and demanding probably a vastly more intricate brain process than that on which any simple sensorial image depends. Most psychologists have given a perfectly clear analysis of the phenomenon we describe. Christian Wolff, for example, writes: Suppose you have seen Mevius in the temple, but now afresh in Titus' house. I say you recognize Mevius, that is, are conscious of having seen him before, because, although now you perceive him with your senses along with Titus' house, your imagination produces an image of him along with one of the temple. And of the acts of your own mind reflecting on Mevius in the temple. Hence the idea of Mevius which is reproduced in sense is contained in another series of perceptions than that which formerly contained it, and this difference is the reason why we are conscious of having had it before. For whilst now you see Mevius in the house of Titus, your imagination places him in the temple, and renders you conscious of the state of mind which you found in yourself when you beheld him there. By this you know that you have seen him before, that is, you recognize him. But you recognize him because his idea is now contained in another series of perceptions from that in which you first saw him. 569. Similarly James Mill writes: In my remembrance of George III, addressing the two Houses of Parliament, there is, first of all, the mere idea, or simple apprehension, the conception, as it is sometimes called, of the objects. There is combined with this, to make it memory, my idea of my having seen and heard those objects. And this combination is so close that it is not in my power to separate them. I cannot have the idea of George III. His person and attitude, the paper he held in his hand, the sound of his voice while reading from it, without having the other idea along with it, that of my having been a witness of the scene. If this explanation of the case in which we remember sensations is understood, the explanation of the case in which we remember ideas cannot occasion much of difficulty. I have a lively recollection of Polyphemus's cave, and the actions of Ulysses and the Cyclops, as described by Homer. In this recollection there is, first of all, the ideas, or simple conceptions of the objects and acts. And along with these ideas, and so closely page 652, bind as not to be separable, the idea of my having formerly had those same ideas. And this idea of my having formerly had those ideas is a very complicated idea. Including the idea of myself of the present moment remembering, and that of myself of the past moment conceiving, and the whole series of the states of consciousness, which intervene between myself remembering, and myself conceiving. 570. Memory is then the feeling of belief in a peculiar complex object, but all the elements of this object may be known to other states of belief. Nor is there in the particular combination of them as they appear in memory anything so peculiar as to lead us to oppose the latter to other sorts of thought as something altogether sui generis, needing a special faculty to account for it. When later we come to our chapter on belief, we shall see that any represented object which is connected either mediately or immediately with our present sensations or emotional activities tends to be believed in as a reality. The sense of a peculiar active relation in it to ourselves is what gives to an object the characteristic quality of reality, and a merely imagined past event differs from a recollected one only in the absence of this peculiar feeling relation. The electric current, so to speak, between it and our present self does not close. But in their other determinations the re-recollected past and the imaginary past may be much the same. In other words, there is nothing unique in the object of memory, and no special faculty is needed to account for its formation. It is a synthesis of parts thought of as related together, perception, imagination, comparison and reasoning being analogous syntheses of parts into complex objects. The objects of any of these faculties may awaken belief or fail to awaken it. The object of memory is only an object imagined in the past, usually very completely imagined there, to which the emotion of belief adheres. Page 653, Memory's Causes. Such being the phenomenon of memory, or the analysis of its object, can we see how it comes to pass? Can we lay bare its causes? Its complete exercise presupposes two things. 1. The retention of the remembered fact. 2. Its reminiscence, recollection, reproduction, or recall. Now the cause both of retention and of recollection is the law of habit in the nervous system, working as it does in the association of ideas. Associationists have long explained recollection by association. James Mill gives an account of it which I am unable to improve upon, unless it might be by translating his word idea into thing thought of, or object, as explained so often before. There is, he says, a state of mind familiar to all men, in which we are said to remember. In this state it is certain we have not in the mind the idea which we are trying to have in it. 571. How is it, then, that we proceed in the course of our endeavor, to procure its introduction into the mind? If we have not the idea itself, we have certain ideas connected with it. We run over those ideas, one after another, in hopes that some one of them will suggest the idea we are in quest of, and if any one of them does, it is always one so connected with it as to call it up in the way of association. I meet an old acquaintance, whose name I do not remember, and wish to recollect. I run over a number of names, in hopes that some of them may be associated with the idea of the individual. I think of all the circumstances in which I have seen him engaged, the time when I knew him, the persons along with whom I knew him, the things he did, or the things he suffered. And, if I chance upon any idea with which the name is associated, then immediately I have the recollection. If not, my pursuit of it is vain. 572. There is another set of cases, very familiar, but affording very important evidence on the subject. It frequently happens that there are matters which we desire not to forget. What is the contrivance to which we have recourse for preserving the memory, that is, for making sure that it will be called into existence, when it is our wish that it should? All men invariably employ the same expedient. They endeavor to form, page 654, an association between the idea of the thing to be remembered, and some sensation, or some idea, which they know beforehand will occur at or near the time when they wish the remembrance to be in their minds. If this association is formed, and the association or idea with which it has been formed occurs, the sensation, or idea, calls up the remembrance, and the object of him who formed the association is attained. To use a vulgar instance, a man receives a commission from his friend, and, that he may not forget it, ties a knot in his handkerchief. How is this fact to be explained? First of all, the idea of the commission is associated with the making of the knot. Next, the handkerchief is a thing which it is known beforehand will be frequently seen, and of course at no great distance of time from the occasion on which the memory is desired. The handkerchief being seen, the knot is seen, and this sensation recalls the idea of the commission, between which and itself the association had been purposely formed. 573. In short, we make search in our memory for a forgotten idea, just as we rummage our house for a lost object. In both cases we visit what seems to us the probable neighborhood of that which we miss. We turn over the things under which, or within which, or alongside of which, it may possibly be, and if it lies near them, it soon comes to view. But these matters, in the case of a mental object sought, are nothing but its associates. The machinery of recall is thus the same as the machinery of association, and the machinery of association, as we know, is nothing but the elementary law of habit in the nerve centers. And this same law of habit is the machinery of retention also. Retention means liability to recall, and it means nothing more than such liability. The only proof of there being retention is that recall actually takes place. The retention of an experience is, in short, but another name for the possibility of thinking it again, or the tendency to think it again, with its past surroundings. Whatever accidental cue may turn this tendency into an actuality, the permanent ground of the tendency itself lies in the organized neural paths by which the cue calls up the experience on the proper occasion, together with its past associates. The sense that the self was there, the belief that it really happened, etc. etc., just as previously described. When the recollection is of the ready sort, the resuscitation takes place the instant, page 655, the occasion arises; when it is slow, resuscitation comes after delay. But be the recall prompt or slow, the condition which makes it possible at all, or in other words, the retention of the experience, is neither more nor less than the brain paths which associate the experience with the occasion and cue of the recall. When slumbering, these paths are the condition of retention; when active, they are the condition of recall. A simple scheme will now make the whole cause of memory plain. Let N be a past event. O its setting, concomitants, date, self-present, warmth and intimacy, etc., etc., as already set forth, and M some present thought or fact which may appropriately become the occasion of its recall. Let the nerve centers, active in the thought of M, N, and O, be represented by M, N, and O, respectively. Then the existence of the paths Mn and No will be the fact indicated by the phrase, retention of the event N in the memory, and the excitement of the brain along these paths will be the condition of the event N's actual recall. The retention of N, it will be observed, is no mysterious storing up of an idea, in an unconscious state. It is not a fact of the mental order at all. It is a purely physical phenomenon, a morphological feature, the presence of these paths, namely, in the finest recesses of the brain's tissue. The recall or recollection, on the other hand, is a psychophysical phenomenon, with both a bodily and a mental side. The bodily side is the functional excitement of the tracts and paths in question. The mental side is the conscious vision of the past occurrence, and the belief that we experienced it before. These habit-worn paths of association are a clear rendering of what authors mean by predispositions, vestiges, traces, etc. left in the brain by past experience. Most writers leave the nature of these vestiges vague; few think, page 656, of explicitly assimilating them to channels of association. Dr. Maudsley, for example, writes, "When an idea which we have once had is excited again, there is a reproduction of the same nervous current. With the conscious addition that it is a reproduction, it is the same idea plus the consciousness that it is the same. The question then suggests itself, what is the physical condition of this consciousness? What is the modification of the anatomical substrata of fibers and cells, or of their physiological activity, which is the occasion of this plus element in the reproduced idea? It may be supposed that the first activity did leave behind it, when it subsided, some after effect, some modification of the nerve element, whereby the nerve circuit was disposed to fall again readily into the same action. Such disposition appearing in consciousness as recognition or memory. Memory is, in fact, the conscious phase of this physiological disposition when it becomes active or discharges its functions on the recurrence of the particular mental experience. To assist our conception of what may happen, let us suppose the individual nerve elements to be endowed with their own consciousness, and let us assume them to be, as I have supposed, modified in a certain way by the first experience. It is hard to conceive that when they fall into the same action on another occasion they should not recognize or remember it. For the second action is a reproduction of the first, with the addition of what it contains from the after effects of the first. As we have assumed the process to be conscious, this reproduction with its addition would be a memory or remembrance. 574. In this passage Dr. Maudsley seems to mean by the nerve element, or anatomical substratum of fibers and cells, something that corresponds to the N of our diagram. And the modification he speaks of seems intended to be understood as an internal modification of this same particular group of elements. Now the slightest reflection will convince anyone that there is no conceivable ground for supposing that with the mere re-excitation of N there should arise the conscious addition, that it is a re-excitation. The two excitations are simply two excitations, their consciousnesses are two consciousnesses, they have nothing to do with each other. And a vague modification, supposed to be left behind by the first excitation, helps us not a whit. For, according to all analogy, such a modification can only result in making the next excitation more smooth and rapid. This might make it less conscious, perhaps, but could not endow, page 657, it with any reference to the past. The gutter is worn deeper by each successive shower, but not for that reason brought into contact with previous showers. Psychology, which Dr. Maudsley in his next sentence says, affords us not the least help in this matter, puts us on the track of an at least possible brain explanation. As it is the setting O of the idea, when it recurs, which makes us conscious of it as past, so it can be no intrinsic modification of the nerve element N which is the organic condition of memory, but something extrinsic to it altogether, namely its connections with those other nerve elements which we called O, that letter standing in the scheme for the cerebral substratum of a great plexus of things other than the principal event remembered, dates, names, concrete surroundings, realized intervals, and what not. The modification is the formation in the plastic nerve substance of the system of associative paths between N and 0. The only hypothesis, in short, to which the facts of inward experience give countenance is that the brain tracts excited by the event proper, and those excited in its recall, are in part different from each other. If we could revive the past event without any associates we should exclude the possibility of memory, and simply dream that we were undergoing the experience as if for the first time. 575, wherever, p. 658, in fact, the recalled event does appear without a definite setting, it is hard to distinguish it from a mere creation of fancy. But in proportion as its image lingers and recalls associates which gradually become more definite, it grows more and more distinctly into a remembered thing. For example, I enter a friend's room and see on the wall a painting. At first I have the strange, wondering consciousness, surely I have seen that before, but when or how does not become clear. There only clings to the picture a sort of penumbra of familiarity, when suddenly I exclaim, I have it, it is a copy of part of one of the Fra Angelicos in the Florentine Academy, I recollect it there. But the motive to the recall does not lie in the fact that the brain tract now excited by the painting was once before excited in a similar way. It lies simply and solely in the fact that with that brain tract other tracts also are excited, those which sustain my friend's room with all its peculiarities, on the one hand. Those which sustain the mental image of the Florence Academy, on the other hand, with the circumstances of my visit there, and finally those which make me, more dimly, think of the years I have lived through between these two times. The result of this total brain disturbance is a thought with a peculiar object, namely, that I who now stand here with this picture before me, stood so many years ago in the Florentine Academy looking at its original. M. Taine has described the gradual way in which a mental image develops into an object of memory, in his usual vivid fashion. He says, I meet casually in the street a person whose appearance I am acquainted with, and say to myself at once that I have seen him before. Instantly the figure recedes into the past, and wavers about there vaguely, without at once fixing itself in any spot. It persists in me for, page 659, some time, and surrounds itself with new details. When I saw him he was bareheaded, with a working jacket on, painting in a studio. He is so and so, of such and such a street. But when was it? It was not yesterday, nor this week, nor recently. I have it. He told me that he was waiting for the first leaves to come out to go into the country. It was before the spring. But at what exact date? I saw, the same day, people carrying branches in the streets and omnibuses. It was Palm Sunday. Observe the travels of the internal figure, its various shiftings to front and rear along the line of the past. Each of these mental sentences has been a swing of the balance. When confronted with the present sensation and with the latent swarm of indistinct images which repeat our recent life, the figure first recoiled suddenly to an indeterminate distance. Then, completed by precise details, and confronted with all the shortened images by which we sum up the proceedings of a day or a week, it again receded beyond the present day, beyond yesterday, the day before, the week, still farther. Beyond the ill-defined mass constituted by our recent recollections. Then something said by the painter was recalled, and it at once receded again beyond an almost precise limit, which is marked by the image of the green leaves and denoted by the word spring. A moment afterwards, thanks to a new detail, the recollection of the branches, it has shifted again, but forward this time, not backward. And, by a reference to the calendar, is situated at a precise point, a week further back than Easter, and 5 weeks nearer than the Carnival, by the double effect of the contrary impulsions, pushing it, one forward and the other backward. And which are, at a particular moment, annulled by one another. 576. The conditions of goodness in memory. The remembered fact being n, then, the path n-o is what arouses for n its setting when it is recalled, and makes it other than a mere imagination. The path m-n, on the other hand, gives the cue or occasion of its being recalled at all. Memory being thus altogether conditioned on brain paths, its excellence in a given individual will depend partly on the number and partly on the persistence of these paths. The persistence or permanence of the paths is a physiological property of the brain tissue of the individual, whilst their number is altogether due to the facts of his mental experience. Let the quality of permanence in the paths be called the native tenacity, or physiological retentiveness. This tenacity differs enormously from infancy to old age, and from one person to another. Some minds are like wax, p. 660, under a seal, no impression, however disconnected with others, is wiped out. Others, like a jelly, vibrate to every touch, but under usual conditions retain no permanent mark. These latter minds, before they can recollect a fact, must weave it into their permanent stores of knowledge. They have no desultory memory. Those persons, on the contrary, who retain names, dates and addresses, anecdotes, gossip, poetry, quotations, and all sorts of miscellaneous facts, without an effort, have desultory memory in a high degree. And certainly owe it to the unusual tenacity of their brain substance for any path once formed therein. No one probably was ever effective on a voluminous scale without a high degree of this physiological retentiveness. In the practical as in the theoretic life, the man whose acquisitions stick is the man who is always achieving and advancing, whilst his neighbors, spending most of their time in relearning what they once knew but have forgotten, simply hold their own. A Charlemagne, a Luther, a Leibniz, a Walter Scott, any example, in short, of your quarto or folio editions of mankind, must needs have amazing retentiveness of the purely physiological sort. Men without this retentiveness may excel in the quality of their work at this point or at that, but will never do such mighty sums of it, or be influential contemporaneously on such a scale. 577. p. 661, but there comes a time of life for all of us when we can do no more than hold our own in the way of acquisitions, when the old paths fade as fast as the new ones form in our brain. And when we forget in a week quite as much as we can learn in the same space of time. This equilibrium may last many, many years. In extreme old age it is upset in the reverse direction, and forgetting prevails over acquisition, or rather there is no acquisition. Brain paths are so transient that in the course of a few minutes of conversation the same question is asked and its answer forgotten half a dozen times. Then the superior tenacity of the paths formed in childhood becomes manifest. The dotard will retrace the facts of his earlier years after he has lost all those of later date. So much for the permanence of the paths. Now for their number. It is obvious that the more there are of such paths as M n in the brain, and the more of such possible cues or occasions for the recall of n in the mind, the prompter and surer, on the whole, the memory of n will be, the more, p. 662, frequently one will be reminded of it, the more avenues of approach to it one will possess. In mental terms, the more other facts a fact is associated with in the mind, the better possession of it our memory retains. Each of its associates becomes a hook to which it hangs, a means to fish it up by when sunk beneath the surface. Together, they form a network of attachments by which it is woven into the entire tissue of our thought. The secret of a good memory is thus the secret of forming diverse and multiple associations with every fact we care to retain. But this forming of associations with a fact, what is it but thinking about the fact as much as possible? Briefly, then, of two men with the same outward experiences and the same amount of mere native tenacity, the one who thinks over his experiences most, and weaves them into systematic relations with each other, will be the one with the best memory. We see examples of this on every hand. Most men have a good memory for facts connected with their own pursuits. The college athlete who remains a dunce at his books will astonish you by his knowledge of men's records in various feats and games, and will be a walking dictionary of sporting statistics. The reason is that he is constantly going over these things in his mind, and comparing and making series of them. They form for him not so many odd facts, but a concept system, so they stick. So the merchant remembers prices, the politician other politicians' speeches and votes, with a copiousness which amazes outsiders, but which the amount of thinking they bestow on these subjects easily explains. The great memory for facts which a Darwin and a Spencer reveal in their books is not incompatible with the possession on their part of a brain with only a middling degree of physiological retentiveness. Let a man early in life set himself the task of verifying such a theory as that of evolution, and facts will soon cluster and cling to him like grapes to their stem. Their relations to the theory will hold them fast. And the more of these the mind is able to discern, the greater the erudition will become. Meanwhile the theorist may have little, if any, desultory memory. Unutilizable facts may be unnoted by him and forgotten as soon as heard. An ignorance, p. 663, almost as encyclopedic as his erudition may coexist with the latter, and hide, as it were, in the interstices of its web. Those who have had much to do with scholars and savants will readily think of examples of the class of mind I mean. In a system, every fact is connected with every other by some thought relation. The consequence is that every fact is retained by the combined suggestive power of all the other facts in the system, and forgetfulness is well nigh impossible. The reason why cramming is such a bad mode of study is now made clear. I mean by cramming that way of preparing for examinations by committing points to memory during a few hours or days of intense application immediately preceding the final ordeal. Little or no work having been performed during the previous course of the term. Things learned thus in a few hours, on one occasion, for one purpose, cannot possibly have formed many associations with other things in the mind. Their brain processes are led into by few paths, and are relatively little liable to be awakened again. Speedy oblivion is the almost inevitable fate of all that is committed to memory in this simple way. Whereas, on the contrary, the same materials taken in gradually, day after day, recurring in different contexts, considered in various relations, associated with other external incidents, and repeatedly reflected on, grow into such a system. Form such connections with the rest of the mind's fabric, lie open to so many paths of approach, that they remain permanent possessions. This is the intellectual reason why habits of continuous application should be enforced in educational establishments. Of course there is no moral turpitude in cramming. If it led to the desired end of secure learning, it would be infinitely the best method of study. But it does not, and students themselves should understand the reason why. One's native retentiveness is unchangeable. It will now appear clear that all improvement of the memory lies in the line of elaborating the associates of each of the several things to be remembered. No amount of culture would seem capable of modifying a man's general, page 664, retentiveness. This is a physiological quality, given once for all with his organization, and which he can never hope to change. It differs no doubt in disease and health. And it is a fact of observation that it is better in fresh and vigorous hours than when we are fagged or ill. We may say, then, that a man's native tenacity will fluctuate somewhat with his hygiene, and that whatever is good for his tone of health will also be good for his memory. We may even say that whatever amount of intellectual exercise is bracing to the general tone and nutrition of the brain will also be profitable to the general retentiveness. But more than this we cannot say. And this, it is obvious, is far less than most people believe. It is, in fact, commonly thought that certain exercises, systematically repeated, will strengthen, not only a man's remembrance of the particular facts used in the exercises, but his faculty for remembering facts at large. And a plausible case is always made out by saying that practice in learning words by heart makes it easier to learn new words in the same way. 578. If this be true, then what I have just said is false, and the whole doctrine of memory as due to paths must be revised. But I am disposed to think the alleged fact untrue. I have carefully questioned several mature actors on the point, and all have denied that the practice of learning parts has made any such difference as is alleged. What it has done for them is to improve their power of studying a part systematically. Their mind is now full of precedents in the way of intonation, emphasis, gesticulation. The new words awaken distinct suggestions and decisions. Are caught up, in fact, into a pre-existing network, like the merchant's prices, or the athlete's store of records, and are recollected easier, although the mere native tenacity is not a whit improved, and is usually, in fact, impaired by age. It is a case of better remembering by better thinking. Similarly, when schoolboys improve by practice in ease of learning by heart, the improvement will, I am sure, be always found to reside in p. 665, the mode of study of the particular piece, due to the greater interest, the greater suggestiveness, the generic similarity with other pieces, the more sustained attention, etc., etc. And not at all to any enhancement of the brute retentive power. The error I speak of pervades an otherwise useful and judicious book, How to Strengthen the Memory, by Dr. Holbrook of New York. 579, the author fails to distinguish between the general physiological retentiveness and the retention of particular things, and talks as if both must be benefited by the same means. I am now treating, he says, a case of loss of memory in a person advanced in years, who did not know that his memory had failed most remarkably till I told him of it. He is making vigorous efforts to bring it back again, and with partial success. The method pursued is to spend 2 hours daily, 1 in the morning and 1 in the evening, in exercising this faculty. The patient is instructed to give the closest attention to all that he learns, so that it shall be impressed on his mind clearly. He is asked to recall every evening all the facts and experiences of the day, and again the next morning. Every name heard is written down and impressed on his mind clearly, and an effort made to recall it at intervals. 10 names from among public men are ordered to be committed to memory every week. A verse of poetry is to be learned, also a verse from the Bible, daily. He is asked to remember the number of the page in any book where any interesting fact is recorded. These and other methods are slowly resuscitating a failing memory. 580. I find it very hard to believe that the memory of the poor old gentleman is a bit the better for all this torture except in respect of the particular facts thus wrought into it, the occurrences attended to and repeated on those days. The names of those politicians, those Bible verses, etc. etc. In another place Dr. Holbrook quotes the account given by the late Thurlow Weed, journalist and politician, of his method of strengthening his memory. My memory was a sieve. I could remember nothing. Dates, names, appointments, faces, everything escaped me. I said to my wife, Catherine, I shall never make a successful politician, for I cannot remember, and that is a prime necessity of politicians. My wife, p. 666, told me I must train my memory. So when I came home that night, I sat down alone and spent 15 minutes trying silently to recall with accuracy the principal events of the day. I could remember but little at first. Now I remember that I could not then recall what I had for breakfast. After a few days' practice I found I could recall more. Events came back to me more minutely, more accurately, and more vividly than at first. After a fortnight or so of this, Catherine said, "Why don't you relate to me the events of the day, instead of recalling them to yourself? It would be interesting, and my interest in it would be a stimulus to you." Having great respect for my wife's opinion, I began a habit of oral confession, as it were, which was continued for almost 50 years. Every night, the last thing before retiring, I told her everything I could remember that had happened to me or about me during the day. I generally recalled the dishes I had had for breakfast, dinner, and tea. The people I had seen and what they had said, the editorials I had written for my paper, giving her a brief abstract of them. I mentioned all the letters I had sent and received, and the very language used, as nearly as possible. When I had walked or ridden, I told her everything that had come within my observation. I found I could say my lessons better and better every year, and instead of the practice growing irksome, it became a pleasure to go over again the events of the day. I am indebted to this discipline for a memory of somewhat unusual tenacity, and I recommend the practice to all who wish to store up facts, or expect to have much to do with influencing men. 581. I do not doubt that Mr. Weed's practical command of his past experiences was much greater after 50 years of this heroic drill than it would have been without it. Expecting to give his account in the evening, he attended better to each incident of the day, named and conceived it differently, set his mind upon it, and in the evening went over it again. He did more thinking about it, and it stayed with him in consequence. But I venture to affirm pretty confidently, although I know how foolish it often is to deny a fact on the strength of a theory, that the same matter, casually attended to and not thought about, would have stuck in his memory no better at the end than at the beginning of his years of heroic self-discipline. He had acquired a better method of noting and recording his experiences, but his physiological retentiveness was probably not a bit improved. 582. p. 667, all improvement of memory consists, then, in the improvement of one's habitual methods of recording facts. Page 668, in the traditional terminology methods are divided into the mechanical, the ingenious, and the judicious. The mechanical methods consist in the intensification, prolongation, and repetition of the impression to be remembered. The modern method of teaching children to read by blackboard work, in which each word is impressed by the fourfold channel of eye, ear, voice, and hand, is an example of an improved mechanical method of memorizing. Judicious methods of remembering things are nothing but logical ways of conceiving them and working them into rational systems, classifying them, analyzing them into parts, etc., etc. All the sciences are such methods. Of ingenious methods, many have been invented, under the name of technical memories. By means of these systems it is often possible to retain entirely disconnected facts, lists of names, numbers, and so forth, so multitudinous as to be entirely unrememberable in a natural way. The method consists usually in a framework learned mechanically, of which the mind is supposed to remain in secure and permanent possession. Then, whatever is to be remembered is deliberately associated by some fanciful analogy or connection with some part of this framework, and this connection thenceforward helps its recall. The best known and most used of these devices is the figure alphabet. To remember numbers, e.g., a figure alphabet is first formed, in which each numerical digit is represented by one or more letters. The number is then translated into such letters as will best make a word, if possible a word suggestive of the object to which the number belongs. Page 669, the word will then be remembered when the numbers alone might be forgotten. The most common figure alphabet is this: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0. T, N, M, R, L, S, H, G, F, B, S. D, J, K, V, P, C. CH, C, Z. G, Q. To briefly show its use, suppose it is desired to fix 1,142 feet in a second as the velocity of sound, T, T, R, N, are the letters and order required. Fill up with vowels forming a phrase, like tight run, and connect it by some such flight of the imagination as that if a man tried to keep up with the velocity of sound, he would have a tight run. When you recall this a few days later, great care must be taken not to get confused with the velocity of light, nor to think he had a hard run, which would be 3,000 feet too fast. 583. Dar. Pick and others use a system which consists in linking together any two ideas to be remembered by means of an intermediate idea which will be suggested by the first and suggest the second, and so on through the list. Thus, let us suppose that we are to retain the following series of ideas: garden, hair, watchman, philosophy, copper, etc. We can combine the ideas in this manner: garden, plant, hair of plant, hair, hair, bonnet, watchman. Watchman, wake, study, philosophy, philosophy, chemistry, copper, etc. etc. Pick. 584. It is matter of popular knowledge that an impression is remembered the better in proportion as it is 1. More recent, 2. More attended to, and 3. More often repeated. The effect of recency is all but absolutely constant. Of two events of equal significance, the remoter one will be the one more likely to be forgotten. The memories of childhood which persist in old age can hardly be compared with the events of the day or hour which are forgotten, for these latter are trivial once repeated things, whilst the p. 670, childish reminiscences have been wrought into us during the retrospective hours of our entire intervening life. Other things equal, at all times of life recency promotes memory. The only exception I can think of is the unaccountable memory of certain moments of our childhood, apparently not fitted by their intrinsic interest to survive, but which are perhaps the only incidents we can remember out of the year in which they occurred. Everybody probably has isolated glimpses of certain hours of his nursery life, the position in which he stood or sat, the light of the room, what his father or mother said, etc. These moments, so oddly selected for immunity from the tooth of time, probably owe their good fortune to historical peculiarities which it is now impossible to trace. Very likely we were reminded of them again soon after they occurred. That became a reason why we should again recollect them, etc., so that at last they became ingrained. The attention which we lend to an experience is proportional to its vivid or interesting character. And it is a notorious fact that what interests us most vividly at the time is, other things equal, what we remember best. An impression may be so exciting emotionally as almost to leave a scar upon the cerebral tissues. And thus originates a pathological delusion. A woman attacked by robbers takes all the men whom she sees, even her own son, for brigands bent on killing her. Another woman sees her child run over by a horse. No amount of reasoning, not even the sight of the living child, will persuade her that he is not killed. A woman called thief in a dispute remains convinced that everyone accuses her of stealing, esquirol. Another, attacked with mania at the sight of the fires in her street during the Commune, still after 6 months sees in her delirium flames on every side about her, lies, etc., etc. 585. On the general effectiveness of both attention and repetition I cannot do better than copy what M. Taine has written. If we compare different sensations, images, or ideas, we find that their aptitudes for revival are not equal. A large number of them are, page 671, obliterated, and never reappear through life. For instance, I drove through Paris a day or two ago, and though I saw plainly some 60 or 80 new faces, I cannot now recall any one of them. Some extraordinary circumstance, a fit of delirium, or the excitement of hashish would be necessary to give them a chance of revival. On the other hand, there are sensations with a force of revival which nothing destroys or decreases. Though, as a rule, time weakens and impairs our strongest sensations, these reappear entire and intense, without having lost a particle of their detail, or any degree of their force. M. Brière de Boismont, having suffered when a child from a disease of the scalp, asserts that, after 55 years have elapsed, he can still feel his hair pulled out under the treatment of the skullcap. For my own part, after 30 years, I remember feature for feature the appearance of the theatre to which I was taken for the first time. From the third row of boxes, the body of the theatre appeared to me an immense well, red and flaming, swarming with heads. Below, on the right, on a narrow floor, 2 men and a woman entered, went out, and re-entered, made gestures, and seemed to me like lively dwarfs. To my great surprise, one of these dwarfs fell on his knees, kissed the lady's hand, then hid behind a screen. The other, who was coming in, seemed angry, and raised his arm. I was then 7, I could understand nothing of what was going on. But the well of crimson velvet was so crowded, gilded, and bright, that after a quarter of an hour I was, as it were, intoxicated, and fell asleep. Every one of us may find similar recollections in his memory, and may distinguish in them a common character. The primitive impression has been accompanied by an extraordinary degree of attention, either as being horrible or delightful, or as being new, surprising, and out of proportion to the ordinary run of our life. This it is we express by saying that we have been strongly impressed, that we were absorbed, that we could not think of anything else, that our other sensations were effaced, that we were pursued all the next day by the resulting image. That it beset us, that we could not drive it away, that all distractions were feeble beside it. It is by force of this disproportion that impressions of childhood are so persistent. The mind being quite fresh, ordinary objects and events are surprising. At present, after seeing so many large halls and full theatres, it is impossible for me, when I enter one, to feel swallowed up, engulfed, and, as it were, lost in a huge dazzling well. The medical man of 60, who has experienced much suffering, both personally and in imagination, would be less upset now by a surgical operation than when he was a child. Whatever may be the kind of attention, voluntary or involuntary, it always acts alike. The image of an object or event is capable of revival, and of complete revival, in proportion to the degree of attention with which we have considered the object or event. We put this rule in practice at every moment in ordinary life. If we are applying ourselves to a book or are in lively conversation, while an air, page 672, is being sung in the adjoining room, we do not retain it, we know vaguely that there is singing going on, and that is all. We then stop our reading or conversation, we lay aside all internal preoccupations and external sensations which our mind or the outer world can throw in our way. We close our eyes, we cause a silence within and about us, and, if the air is repeated, we listen. We say then that we have listened with all our ears, that we have applied our whole minds. If the air is a fine one, and has touched us deeply, we add that we have been transported, uplifted, ravished, that we have forgotten the world and ourselves, that for some minutes our soul was dead to all but sounds. This exclusive momentary ascendancy of one of our states of mind explains the greater durability of its aptitude for revival and for more complete revival. As the sensation revives in the image reappears with a force proportion to that of the sensation. What we meet with in the first state is also to be met with in the second, since the second is but a revival of the first. So, in the struggle for life, in which all our images are constantly engaged, the one furnished at the outset with most force retains in each conflict, by the very law of repetition which gives it being, the capacity of treading down its adversaries. This is why it revives, incessantly at first, then frequently, until at last the laws of progressive decay, and the continual accession of new impressions bake away its preponderance, and its competitors, finding a clear field, are able to develop in their turn. A second cause of prolonged revivals is repetition itself. Every one knows that to learn a thing we must not only consider it attentively, but consider it repeatedly. We say as to this in ordinary language, that an impression many times renewed is imprinted more deeply and exactly on the memory. This is how we contrive to retain a language, airs of music, passages of verse or prose, the technical terms and propositions of a science, and still more so the ordinary facts by which our conduct is regulated. When, from the form and color of a currant jelly, we think of its taste, or, when tasting it with our eyes shut, we imagine, its red tint and the brilliancy of a quivering slice, the images in our mind are brightened by repetition. Whenever we eat, or drink, or walk, or avail ourselves of any of our senses, or commence or continue any action whatever, the same thing happens. Every man and every animal thus possesses at every moment of life a certain stock of clear and easily reviving images, which had their source in the past in a confluence of numerous experiences, and are now fed by a flow of renewed experiences. When I want to go from the Tuileries to the Pantheon, or from my study to the dining room, I foresee at every turn the colored forms which will present themselves to my sight. It is otherwise in the case of a house where I have spent 2 hours, or of a town where I have stayed 3 days. After 10 years have elapsed the images will be vague, full of blanks, sometimes they will not exist, and I shall have to seek my way or shall lose myself. This new property of, page 673, images is also derived from the first. As every sensation tends to revive in its image, the sensation twice repeated will leave after it a double tendency, that is, provided the attention be as great the second time as the first. Usually this is not the case, for, the novelty diminishing, the interest diminishes. But if other circumstances renew the interest, or if the will renovates the attention, the incessantly increasing tendency will incessantly increase the chances of the resurrection and integrity of the image. 586. If a phenomenon is met with, however, too often, and with too great a variety of contexts, although its image is retained and reproduced with correspondingly great facility, it fails to come up with any one particular setting. And the projection of it backwards to a particular past date consequently does not come about. We recognize but do not remember it, its associates form too confused a cloud. No one is said to remember, says Mr. Spencer, that the object at which he looks has an opposite side. Or that a certain modification of the visual impression implies a certain distance, or that the thing he sees moving about is a live animal. To ask a man whether he remembers that the sun shines, that fire burns, that iron is hard, would be a misuse of language. Even the almost fortuitous connections among our experiences cease to be classed as memories when they have become thoroughly familiar. Though, on hearing the voice of some unseen person slightly known to us, we say we recollect to whom the voice belongs, we do not use the same expression respecting the voices of those with whom we live. The meanings of words which in childhood have to be consciously recalled seem in adult life to be immediately present. 587. These are cases where too many paths, leading to too diverse associates, block each other's way, and all that the mind gets along with its object is a fringe of felt familiarity or sense that there are associates. A similar result comes about when a definite setting is only nascently aroused. We then feel that we have seen the object already, but when or where we cannot say, though we may seem to ourselves to be on the brink of saying it. That nascent cerebral excitations can affect consciousness with a sort of sense of the imminence of that which stronger excitations would make us definitely feel, is obvious from what happens when we, page 674, seek to remember a name. It tingles, it trembles on the verge, but does not come. Just such a tingling and trembling of unrecovered associates is the penumbra of recognition that may surround any experience and make it seem familiar, though we know not why. 588. p. 675, there is a curious experience which everyone seems to have had, the feeling that the present moment in its completeness has been experienced before, we were saying just this thing, in just this place, to just these people, etc. This sense of pre-existence has been treated as a great mystery and occasioned much speculation. Dar. Wigan considered it due to a dissociation of the action of the two hemispheres, one of them becoming conscious a little later than the other, but both of the same fact, 589, I must confess that, p. 676, the quality of mystery seems to me a little strained. I have over and over again in my own case succeeded in resolving the phenomenon into a case of memory, so indistinct that whilst some past circumstances are presented again, the others are not. The dissimilar portions of the past do not arise completely enough at first for the date to be identified. All we get is the present scene with a general suggestion of pastness about it. That faithful observer, Prof. Lazarus, interprets the phenomenon the same way Winkwith frowned 590, and it is noteworthy that just as soon as the past context grows complete and distinct the emotion of weirdness fades from the experience. Exact measurements of memory have recently been made in Germany. Professor Ebbinghaus, in a really heroic series of daily observations of more than 2 years' duration, examined the powers of retention and reproduction. He learned lists of meaningless syllables by heart, and tested his recollection of them from day to day. He could not remember more than 7 after a single reading. It took, however, 16 readings to remember 12, 44 readings to remember 24, and 55 readings to remember 26 syllables, the moment of remembering being here reckoned as the first moment when the list could be recited without a fault. 591, when a 16-syllable list was read over a certain number of times on one day, and then studied on the day following until remembered. It was found that the number of seconds saved in the study on the second day was proportional to the number of readings on the first, proportional, that is, within certain rather narrow limits, for which see the text. 592, no amount of repetition spent on nonsense verses over a certain length enabled Dr. Ebbinghaus to retain them without error for 24 hours. In forgetting such things as these lists of syllables, the loss goes on very much more rapidly at first than later on. He measured the loss by the number of seconds page 677, required to relearn the list after it had been once learned. Roughly speaking, if it took 1,000 seconds to learn the list, and 500 to relearn it, the loss between the two learnings would have been 1/2. Measured in this way, full half of the forgetting seems to occur within the first half hour, whilst only 4/5 is forgotten at the end of a month. The nature of this result might have been anticipated, but hardly its numerical proportions. Dr. Ebbinghaus says, the initial rapidity, as well as the final slowness, as these were ascertained under certain experimental conditions and for a particular individual, may well surprise us. An hour after the work of learning had ceased, forgetting was so far advanced that more than half of the original work had to be applied again before the series of syllables could once more be reproduced. 8 hours later 2/3 of the original labor had to be applied. Gradually, however, the process of oblivion grew slower, so that even for considerable stretches of time the losses were but barely ascertainable. After 24 hours 1/3, after 6 days 1/4, and after a whole month a good 1/5 of the original labor remain in the shape of its after-effects, and made the relearning by so much the more speedy. 593. But the most interesting result of all those reached by this author relates to the question whether ideas are recalled only by those that previously came immediately before them, or whether an idea can possibly recall another idea with which it was never in immediate contact, without passing through the intermediate mental links. The question is of theoretic importance with regard to the way in which the process of association of ideas must be conceived, and Dr. Ebbinghaus's attempt is as successful as it is original, in bringing two views, which seem at first sight inaccessible to proof, to a direct practical test, and giving the victory to one of them. His experiments conclusively show that an idea is not only associated directly with the one that follows it, and with the rest through that, but that it is directly associated with all that are near it, though in unequal degrees. He first measured the time needed to impress on the memory certain lists of syllables, and then the time needed to impress lists of the same syllables with gaps between them. Thus, representing the p. 678 syllables by numbers, if the first list were 1, 2, 3, 4, 13, 14, 15, 16, the second would be 1, 3, 5.15, 2, 4, 6.16, and so forth, with many variations. Now, if 1 and 3 in the first list were learned in that order merely by 1 calling up 2, and by 2 calling up 3, leaving out the 2 ought to leave 1 and 3 with no tie in the mind. And the second list ought to take as much time in the learning as if the first list had never been heard of. If, on the other hand, 1 has a direct influence on 3 as well as on 2, that influence should be exerted even when 2 is dropped out. And a person familiar with the first list ought to learn the second one more rapidly than otherwise he could. This latter case is what actually occurs, and Dr. Ebbinghaus has found that syllables originally separated by as many as 7 intermediaries still reveal, by the increased rapidity with which they are learned in order, the strength of the tie that the original learning established between them. Over the heads, so to speak, of all the rest. These last results ought to make us careful, when we speak of nervous paths, to use the word in no restricted sense. They add one more fact to the set of facts which prove that association is subtler than consciousness, and that a nerve process may, without producing consciousness, be effective in the same way in which consciousness would have seemed to be effective if it had been there. 594, evidently the path from 1. p. 679, to 3, omitting 2 from consciousness, is facilitated, broadened perhaps, by the old path from 1 to 3 through 2, only the component which shoots round through this latter way is too feeble to let 2 be thought as a distinct object. Mr. Wolf, in his experiments on recognition, used vibrating metal tongues. These tongues gave tones differing by 2 vibrations only in the 2 lower octaves, and by 4 vibrations in the 3 higher octaves. In the first series of experiments a tone was selected, and, after sounding it for 1 second, a second tone was sounded, which was either the same as the first, or different from it by 4, 8, or 12 vibrations in different series. The person experimented upon was to answer whether the second tone was the same as the first, thus showing that he recognized it, or whether it was different, and, if so, whether it was higher or lower. Of course, the interval of time between the 2 tones was an important factor. The proportionate number of correct judgments, and the smallness of the difference of the vibration rates of the 2 tones, would measure the accuracy of the tone memory. It appeared that one could tell more readily when the 2 tones were alike than when they were different, although in both cases the accuracy of the memory was remarkably good. The main point is the effect of the time interval between the tone and its reproduction. This was varied from 1 second to 30 seconds, or even to 60 seconds or 120 seconds in some experiments. The general result is, that the longer the interval, the smaller are the chances that the tone will be recognized, and this process of forgetting takes place at first very rapidly, and then more slowly. This law is subject to considerable variations, one of which seems to be constant and is peculiar, namely, there seems to be a rhythm in the memory itself, which, after falling, recovers slightly, and then fades out again. 595. This periodical renewal of acoustic memory would seem to be an important element in the production of the agreeableness of certain rates of recurrence in sound. Forgetting. In the practical use of our intellect, forgetting is as important a function as recollecting. Locke says, in a memorable page of his dear old book, "The memory of some men, it is true, is very tenacious, even to a miracle. But yet there seems to be a constant decay of all our ideas," page 680, "even of those which are struck deepest, and in minds the most retentive. So that if they be not sometimes renewed by repeated exercise of the senses, or reflection on those kinds of objects which at first occasion them, the print wears out, and at last there remains nothing to be seen. Thus the ideas, as well as children, of our youth, often die before us, and our minds represent to us those tombs to which we are fast approaching. Where, though the brass and marble remain, yet the inscriptions are effaced by time, and the imagery moulders away. The pictures drawn in our minds are laid in fading colors, and, if not sometimes refreshed, vanish and disappear. How much the constitution of our bodies, and the make of our animal spirits, are concerned in this. And whether the temper of the brain makes this difference, that in some it retains the characters drawn on it like marble, in others like freestone, and in others little better than sand, I shall not here inquire. Though it may seem probable that the constitution of the body does sometimes influence the memory. Since we oftentimes find a disease quite strip the mind of all its ideas, and the flames of a fever in a few days calcine all those images to dust and confusion, which seem to be as lasting as if graven in marble. 596. This peculiar mixture of forgetting with our remembering is but one instance of our mind's selective activity. Selection is the very keel on which our mental ship is built. And in this case of memory its utility is obvious. If we remembered everything, we should on most occasions be as ill off as if we remembered nothing. It would take as long for us to recall a space of time as it took the original time to elapse, and we should never get ahead with our thinking. All recollected times undergo, accordingly, what M. Ribot calls foreshortening, and this foreshortening is due to the omission of an enormous number of the facts which filled them. As fast as the present enters into the past, our states of consciousness disappear and are obliterated. Passed in review at a few days' distance, nothing or little of them remains, most of them have made shipwreck in that great nonentity from which they never more will emerge. And they have carried with them the quantity of duration which was inherent in their being. This deficit of surviving conscious states is thus a deficit in the amount of represented time. The process of abridgment, of foreshortening, of which we have spoken, presupposes this deficit. If, in order to reach a distant reminiscence, we had to go through the entire series of terms which separate it from our present selves, memory would become impossible on account of the length of the operation. We, p. 681, thus reach the paradoxical result that one condition of remembering is that we should forget. Without totally forgetting a prodigious number of states of consciousness, and momentarily forgetting a large number, we could not remember at all. Oblivion, except in certain cases, is thus no malady of memory, but a condition of its health and its life. 597. There are many irregularities in the process of forgetting which are as yet unaccounted for. A thing forgotten on one day will be remembered on the next. Something we have made the most strenuous efforts to recall, but all in vain, will, soon after we have given up the attempt, saunter into the mind, as Emerson somewhere says, as innocently as if it had never been sent for. Experiences of bygone date will revive after years of absolute oblivion, often as the result of some cerebral disease or accident which seems to develop latent paths of association. As the photographer's fluid develops the picture sleeping in the collodion film. The oftenest quoted of these cases is Coleridge's. In a Roman Catholic town in Germany, a young woman, who could neither read nor write, was seized with a fever, and was said by the priests to be possessed of a devil. Because she was heard talking Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. Whole sheets of her ravings were written out, and found to consist of sentences intelligible in themselves, but having slight connection with each other. Of her Hebrew sayings, only a few could be traced to the Bible, and most seemed to be in the rabbinical dialect. All trick was out of the question, the woman was a simple creature, there was no doubt as to the fever. It was long before any explanation, save that of demoniacal possession, could be obtained. At last the mystery was unveiled by a physician, who determined to trace back the girl's history, and who, after much trouble, discovered that at the age of 9 she had been charitably taken by an old Protestant pastor, a great Hebrew scholar, in whose house she lived till his death. On further inquiry it appeared to have been the old man's custom for years to walk up and down a passage of his house into which the kitchen opened, and to read to himself with a loud voice out of his books. The books were ransacked, and among them were found several of the Greek and Latin fathers, together with a collection of rabbinical writings. In these works so many of the passages taken down at the young woman's bedside were identified that there could be no reasonable doubt as to their source. 598. Page 682, hypnotic subjects as a rule forget all that has happened in their trance. But in a succeeding trance they will often remember the events of a past one. This is like what happens in those cases of double personality, in which no recollection of one of the lives is to be found in the other. We have already seen in an earlier chapter that the sensibility often differs from one of the alternate personalities to another, and we have heard M. Pierre Janet's theory that anesthesias carry amnesias with them, see above, pages 385 ff. In certain cases this is evidently so, the throwing of certain functional brain tracts out of gear with others, so as to dissociate their consciousness from that of the remaining brain. Throws them out for both sensorial and ideational service. M. Janet proved in various ways that what his patients forgot when anesthetic they remembered when the sensibility returned. For instance, he restored their tactile sense temporarily by means of electric currents, passes, etc., and then made them handle various objects, such as keys and pencils, or make particular movements. Like the sign of the cross. The moment the anesthesia returned they found it impossible to recollect the objects or the acts. They had had nothing in their hands, they had done nothing, etc. The next day, however, sensibility being again restored by similar processes, they remembered perfectly the circumstance, and told what they had handled or had done. All these pathological facts are showing us that the sphere of possible recollection may be wider than we think, and that in certain matters apparent oblivion is no proof against possible recall under other conditions. They give no countenance, however, to the extravagant opinion that, page 683, nothing we experience can be absolutely forgotten. In real life, in spite of occasional surprises, most of what happens actually is forgotten. The only reasons for supposing that if the conditions were forthcoming everything would revive are of a transcendental sort. Sir William Hamilton quotes and adopts them from the German writer Schmid. Knowledge being a spontaneous self-energy on the part of the mind. This energy being once determined, it is natural that it should persist, until again annihilated by other causes. This, annihilation, would be the case, were the mind merely passive. But the mental activity, the act of knowledge, of which I now speak, is more than this. It is an energy of the self-active power of a subject one and indivisible. Consequently a part of the ego must be detached or annihilated, if a cognition once existent be again extinguished. Hence it is that the problem most difficult of solution is not, how a mental activity endures, but how it ever vanishes. 599. Those whom such an argument persuades may be left happy with their belief. Other positive argument there is none, none certainly of a physiological sort. 600. When memory begins to decay, proper names are what go first, and at all times proper names are harder to recollect than those of general properties and classes of things. This seems due to the fact that common qualities and names have contracted an infinitely greater number of associations in our mind than the names of most of the persons whom we know. Their memory is better organized. Proper names as well organized as those of our family and friends are recollected as well as those of any other objects. 601. Organization means numerous associations. And the more numerous the associations, the greater the number of paths of recall. For the same reason adjectives, conjunctions, prepositions, and the cardinal verbs, those words, in short, which form the grammatical framework of all our speech, are the, page 684, very last to decay. Kussmaul, 602, makes the following acute remark on this subject. The concreter a conception is, the sooner is its name forgotten. This is because our ideas of persons and things are less strongly bound up with their names than with such abstractions as their business, their circumstances, their qualities. We easily can imagine persons and things without their names, the sensorial image of them being more important than that other symbolic image, their name. Abstract conceptions, on the other hand, are only acquired by means of the words which alone serve to confer stability upon them. This is why verbs, adjectives, pronouns, and still more adverbs, prepositions, and conjunctions are more intimately connected with our thinking than our substantives. The disease called aphasia, of which a little was said in Chapter 2, has let in a flood of light on the phenomenon of memory, by showing the number of ways in which the use of a given object, like a word, may be lost by the mind. We may lose our acoustic idea or our articulatory idea of it, neither without the other will give up proper command of the word. And if we have both, but have lost the paths of association between the brain centers which support the two, we are in as bad a plight. Ataxic and amnesic aphasia, word deafness, and associative aphasia, are all practical losses of word memory. We have thus, as M. Ribot says, not memory so much as memories. 603, the visual, the tactile, the muscular, the auditory memory may all vary independently of each other in the same individual, and different individuals may have them developed in different degrees. As a rule, a man's memory is good in the departments in which his interest is strong, but those departments are apt to be those in which his discriminative sensibility is high. A man with a bad ear is not likely to have practically a good musical memory, or a purblind person to remember visual appearance well. In a later chapter we shall see illustrations of the differences in men's imagining power. 604, it is obvious that the machinery of memory must be largely determined thereby. Page 685, Mr. Galton, in his work on English Men of Science, 605, has given a very interesting collation of cases showing individual variations in the type of memory, where it is strong. Some have it verbal. Others have it good for facts and figures, others for form. Most say that what is to be remembered must first be rationally conceived and assimilated. 606. There is an interesting fact connected with remembering, which, so far as I know, Mr. R. Verdon was the first writer expressly to call attention to. We can set our memory as it were to retain things for a certain time, and then let them depart. Individuals often remember clearly and well up to the time when they have to use their knowledge, and then, when it is no longer required, there follows a rapid and extensive decay of the traces. Many schoolboys forgot their lessons after they have said them, many barristers forgot details got up for a particular case. Thus a boy learns 30 lines of Homer, says them perfectly, and then forgets them so that he could not say 5 consecutive lines the next morning, and a barrister may be 1 week learned in the mysteries of making cogwheels. But in the next he may be well acquainted with the anatomy of the ribs instead. 607. The rationale of this fact is obscure, and the existence of it ought to make us feel how truly subtle are the nervous processes which memory involves. Mr. Verdon adds that when the use of a record is withdrawn, and attention withdrawn from it, and we think no more about it, we know that we experience a feeling of relief, and we may thus conclude that energy is in some way liberated. If the attention is not withdrawn, so that we keep the record in mind, we know that this feeling of relief does not take place. Also we are well aware, not only that after this feeling of relief takes place, the record does not seem so well conserved as before, but that we have real difficulty in attempting to remember it. This shows that we are not as entirely unconscious of a topic as we think, during the time in which we seem to be merely retaining its subject to recall. Page 686, practically, says Mr. Verdon, we sometimes keep a matter in hand not exactly by attending to it, but by keeping our attention referred to something connected with it from time to time. Translating this into the language of physiology, we mean that by referring attention to a part within, or closely connected with, the system of traces, paths, required to be remembered, we keep it well fed. So that the traces are preserved with the utmost delicacy. This is perhaps as near as we can get to an explanation. Setting the mind to remember a thing involves a continual minimal irradiation of excitement into paths which lead thereto, involves the continued presence of the thing in the fringe of our consciousness. Letting the thing go involves withdrawal of the irradiation, unconsciousness of the thing, and, after a time, obliteration of the paths. A curious peculiarity of our memory is that things are impressed better by active than by passive repetition. I mean that in learning by heart, for example, when we almost know the piece, it pays better to wait and recollect by an effort from within, than to look at the book again. If we recover the words in the former way, we shall probably know them the next time, if in the latter way, we shall very likely need the book once more. The learning by heart means the formation of paths from a former set to a later set of cerebral word processes, call 1 and 2 in the diagram the processes in question. Then when we remember by inward effort, the path is formed by discharge from 1 to 2, just as it will afterwards be used. But when we excite 2 by the eye, although the path 1, 2 doubtless is then shot through also, the phenomenon which we are discussing shows that the direct discharge from 1 into 2, unaided by the eyes, plows the deeper and more permanent groove. There is, moreover, a greater amount of tension accumulated in the brain before the discharge from 1 to 2, when the latter takes place unaided by the eye. This is proved by the general feeling of strain in the effort to remember 2, and this, p. 687, also ought to make the discharge more violent and the path more deep. A similar reason doubtless accounts for the familiar fact that we remember our own theories, our own discoveries, combinations, inventions, in short whatever ideas originate in our own brain. 1,000 times better than exactly similar things which are communicated to us from without. A word, in closing, about the metaphysics involved in remembering. According to the assumptions of this book, thoughts accompany the brain's workings, and those thoughts are cognitive of realities. The whole relation is one which we can only write down empirically, confessing that no glimmer of explanation of it is yet in sight. That brains should give rise to a knowing consciousness at all, this is the one mystery which returns, no matter of what sort the consciousness and of what sort the knowledge may be. Sensations, aware of mere qualities, involve the mystery as much as thoughts, aware of complex systems, involve it. To the Platonizing tradition in philosophy, however, this is not so. Sensational consciousness is something quasi-material, hardly cognitive, which one need not much wonder at. Relating consciousness is quite the reverse, and the mystery of it is unspeakable. Professor Ladd, for example, in his usually excellent book, 608, after well showing the matter-of-fact dependence of retention and reproduction on brain paths, says, in the study of perception psychophysics can do much towards a scientific explanation. It can tell what qualities of stimuli produce certain qualities of sensations, it can suggest a principle relating the quantity of the stimuli to the intensity of the sensation. It can investigate the laws under which, by combined action of various excitations, the sensations are combined, into presentations of sense. It can show how the time relations of the sensations and percepts in consciousness correspond to the objective relations in time of the stimulations. But for that spiritual activity which actually puts together in consciousness the sensations, it cannot even suggest the beginning of a physical explanation. Moreover, no cerebral process can be conceived of, which, in case it were known to exist, could possibly be regarded as a fitting basis for this unifying actus of mind. Thus also, and even more emphatically, must we insist upon the complete inability of physiology to, page 688, suggest an explanation for conscious memory, in so far as it is memory, that is, in so far as it most imperatively calls for explanation. The very essence of the act of memory consists in the ability to say, this after-image is the image of a percept I had a moment since. Or this image of memory is the image of the percept I had at a certain time, I do not remember precisely how long since. It would, then, be quite contrary to the facts to hold that, when an image of memory appears in consciousness, it is recognized as belonging to a particular original percept on account of its perceived resemblance to this percept. The original percept does not exist and will never be reproduced. Even more palpably false and absurd would it be to hold that any similarity of the impressions or processes in end organs or central organs explains the act of conscious memory. Consciousness knows nothing of such similarity, knows nothing even of the existence of nervous impressions and processes. Moreover, we could never know two impressions or processes that are separated in time to be similar, without involving the same inexplicable act of memory. It is a fact of consciousness on which all possibility of connected experience and of recorded and cumulative human knowledge is dependent that certain phases or products of consciousness appear with a claim to stand for, to represent, 609, past experiences to which they are regarded as in some respect similar. It is this peculiar claim in consciousness which constitutes the essence of an act of memory. It is this which makes the memory wholly inexplicable as a mere persistence or recurrence of similar impressions. It is this which makes conscious memory a spiritual phenomenon, the explanation of which, as arising out of nervous processes and conditions, is not simply undiscovered in fact, but utterly incapable of approach by the imagination. When, then, we speak of a physical basis of memory, recognition must be made of the complete inability of science to suggest any physical process which can be conceived of as correlated with that peculiar and mysterious actus of the mind, connecting its present and its past, which constitutes the essence of memory. This passage seems to me characteristic of the reigning halfway modes of thought. It puts the difficulties in the wrong places. At one moment it seems to admit with the cruder sensationalists that the material of our thoughts is independent sensations reproduced, and that the putting together of these sensations would be knowledge, if it could only be brought about. The only mystery being as to the what actus can bring it about. At another moment it seems to contend that even this sort of combining would not be knowledge, because certain of the elements p. 689, next must claim to represent or stand for past originals, which is incompatible with their being mere images revived. The result is various confused and scattered mysteries and unsatisfied intellectual desires. But why not pool our mysteries into one great mystery, the mystery that brain processes occasion knowledge at all? It is surely no different mystery to feel myself by means of one brain process writing at this table now, and by means of a different brain process a year hence to remember myself writing. All that psychology can do is to seek to determine what the several brain processes are, and this, in a wretchedly imperfect way, is what such writings as the present chapter have begun to do. But of images reproduced, and claiming to represent, and put together by a unifying actus, I have been silent, because such expressions either signify nothing, or they are only roundabout ways of simply saying that the past is known when certain brain conditions are fulfilled, and it seems to me that the straightest and shortest way of saying that is the best. For a history of opinion about memory, and other bibliographic references, I must refer to the admirable little monograph on the subject by Mr. W. H. Burnham in the American Journal of Psychology, Volumes 1 and 2. Useful books are, D. K.'s Memory, What It Is, and How to Improve It, 1888, and F. Voth's Das Gedächtnis, Studie zu einer Pädagogik, etc., 1888. End of Volume 1.